We are looking at the first chapter of 1 Samuel. This historical record ignores the movements of armies and empires to focus on a single domestic crisis. The central figure is Hannah, a woman suffering from barrenness. In her ancient context, the inability to bear children was a mark of severe social failure, often interpreted by the community as a sign of divine disfavor. Her agony is sharpened by Peninnah, her husband's second wife, who has multiple children. Peninnah uses her status to provoke and humiliate Hannah daily, turning a private medical tragedy into a weapon of psychological torment. Hannah is trapped at the intersection of a deep, unfulfilled desire and a toxic social environment. She faces a deficit that no earthly remedy can resolve. When we face constant provocation, the baseline human instinct is to retaliate. The common response is to descend into a cycle of arguments and bitterness, trying to win a fight that has no end. These taunts are a trap designed to keep Hannah's focus on a horizontal level, locked in an unwinnable earthly conflict with a rival. Carrying that weight of unreciprocated anger creates a heavy emotional toll. It fills the mind with noise, isolating the victim inside a storm of anxiety. This creates the core dilemma. When a tragedy cannot be fixed by human arguments or revenge, where should that pain be directed? Hannah makes a physical and spiritual shift. She leaves the domestic conflict behind and travels to the tabernacle at Shiloh. She chooses to bypass human retaliation. She takes her agony straight to the source, appealing directly to God. Her prayer is unusual. Her lips move, but she makes no sound. She is pouring her soul out in a way that prioritizes internal depth over vocal volume. This silence is misread by the high priest, Eli. He watches her trembling lips and assumes he is witnessing public drunkenness. While the earthly authority misinterprets her deep grief, the divine authority receives her silent desperation with absolute, perfect clarity. This moment shows that communion with God does not depend on the eloquence of words, but on the raw authenticity of a heart that has stopped fighting people and started seeking help. During this prayer, Hannah makes a radical vow. If she is given a son, she will permanently give him back to the service of the Lord. She is asking for her ultimate personal blessing and immediately redirecting it. She seeks the fulfillment of her desire only to relinquish her ownership of it. Hannah's internal state immediately changes. Her face loses its sadness, and she enters a state of absolute peace. This peace arrives before the circumstances change. She is not yet pregnant, and the external reality of her life is exactly as it was before. She has secured internal rest based entirely on the character of the one listening to her, long before she sees the results of her request. The narrative records that God answers the prayer. Samuel is born. Now Hannah faces a final test. Will she follow through on the immense cost of her promise? She does. Once the child is weaned, she travels back to Shiloh and surrenders Samuel to the temple, just as she said she would. She treats this as a joyful consecration, returning her best blessing to its source. In this text, spiritual victory is found in the discipline to position what we love most within a purpose larger than our own satisfaction. The boy she left behind in the temple becomes the central figure of the next era. Samuel grows into the prophet who ends the chaotic era of the judges and anoints the first kings of Israel, including David. A direct causal line exists between these massive geopolitical shifts and the silent, agonizing prayer of a single woman in the tabernacle. Hannah's personal despair, once surrendered, became the specific starting point for the rise of the monarchy. We make promises to God. We say we'll pray more, read more, or be more patient. But often, those promises fade the moment we face the first stressful email of the morning. Maintaining a sacred covenant requires active, daily effort on our part in order to continually keep that spiritual connection taut. The reflection on 1 Samuel chapter 2 provided in our source material forces a sharp look at how we handle our end of that connection. We are going to take the theology from this chapter and translate it into a concrete, 3-step daily covenant action plan. To follow along, grab a physical journal and a pen and open your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 2. Our ultimate goal is to move from simply reading the text to integrating these core principles into your actual morning schedule. Start by writing this at the top of your page. God is sovereign, faithful, and just. This establishes our starting point. God exercises absolute control over all things, and His faithfulness to His word is the constant that makes our own promises possible. Because He perfectly upholds His side of the agreement, our task is to define a specific daily response. Draw a T-chart on your page. Label the left column the priests and the right column Hannah. On the left, we see two priests who had specific instructions for their role. They chose to ignore them, treating their covenant obligations as optional. By disregarding the boundaries God set, they faced divine judgment and the eventual destruction of their lineage. Hannah took the opposite path. She fulfilled her vow by giving up her son to the temple, approaching the sacrifice with a sincere heart. Under Hannah's name on your chart, write joyful willingness. In verse 21, we see the result. God responded to Hannah's faithfulness by blessing her with 5 more children and showing her great mercy. This history shows a reciprocal relationship. Hannah's willing sacrifice was met with God's direct blessing and presence. This brings us to the core principle found in verse 30. Write this phrase in large letters across the center of your page. Those who honor me, I will honor. Honoring God happens through the small choices made throughout a Tuesday afternoon. It is the way we apply our faith to our actions. When we treat His instructions with respect, the text suggests He places value and weight upon our lives. Conversely, the second half of that verse warns that ignoring these instructions leads to being minimized and losing spiritual direction. Choosing to honor God in mundane moments is the specific action that leads to receiving His clarity and protection. This leads to the question we started with. What specific covenant habits do we need to keep today? We can translate the principles from 1 Samuel 2 into a modern daily checklist. Habit 1 is the morning surrender. Dedicate your day to God immediately upon waking, mirroring how Hannah dedicated her son. Habit 2 is joyful integrity at work. Complete your tasks honestly and without complaining, acting as a direct contrast to the corruption of the priests. Habit 3 is the evening gratitude. End your day with prayers of thanksgiving, following the pattern of Hannah's prayer of praise. These 3 habits create a structure for the day, ensuring the morning, afternoon, and evening are each aligned with the commitment to honor God. By completing this, you have taken the historical examples of 1 Samuel 2 and turned them into a practical plan. Keep this list visible. Tear the page out and tape it to your mirror, or use it as your phone's lock screen. Your next step is to execute Habit 1 tomorrow morning, before you check any digital devices. Consistency in these 3 choices is how you honor God. When you do, you can trust in His promise.
At the opening of 1 Samuel chapter 3, we find a society in a spiritual vacuum. The historical record states, "The word of the Lord was rare. There were no frequent visions." It raises a difficult question. Why would the creator of the universe go silent? The answer starts with the high priest, Eli. He was old, and his physical eyesight was failing, leaving him virtually blind. But this loss of vision serves as a direct metaphor for his internal state. His spiritual senses had become entirely numb. Eli's numbness was the result of a specific choice. He honored the desires of people, his own corrupt sons, above the holiness of God. This compromise created a barrier. When human comfort is prioritized over divine respect, the communication stops. This inverse correlation model illustrates the dynamic. As the weight of human compromise piles up on one side, through withheld resources, neglected prayer, or treating gatherings as optional, the indicator for divine communication drops to 0. Without the voice of God, a community loses its vitality. Restoring that voice isn't a matter of technique, but of radically reprioritizing God's position in daily life. To break the silence, God bypasses the entire religious hierarchy. Instead of speaking to the high priest, he calls out to a young boy in the middle of the night. Samuel didn't recognize the voice at first,
but he demonstrated a necessary patience. He repeatedly got out of bed to check on Eli, willing to respond even before he understood who was actually speaking. This chaotic waveform represents modern environmental noise, effectively masking the steady, quiet signal of divine communication. To isolate the signal, you must flatten the noise. This means sacrificing sleep, waking early, and setting aside distractions to create a receptive mental space. Hearing God is a deliberate outcome. It is the result of trading personal comfort for a quiet, attentive posture. Samuel was already living in the temple and performing the duties of a priest, yet the text makes a striking distinction. He did not yet know the Lord. This reveals the gap between administrative service and spiritual connection. It is possible to be deeply involved in the mechanics of a church while remaining distant from the person the church is built for. Knowing God requires moving past passive involvement into an interactive dialogue with the Holy Spirit. It is a shift from working for a deity to responding to a present voice. This interaction changes how one reads Scripture and senses the movement of the Spirit. Even when the message is difficult, as it was for Samuel, who had to deliver a terrifying word of judgment, the listener gains a clear sense of God's heart and direction. Ultimately, spiritual maturity isn't measured by the hours spent in service, but by the depth and clarity of that interactive dialogue. When Eli hears Samuel's message of judgment, he is completely unmoved by the warning. He is spiritually paralyzed, as unresponsive as the sinking stone. Samuel's trajectory was the opposite. Because he maintained an attentive listening posture, he became the nation's new prophet, and the record states that none of his words fell to the ground. This highlights a consistent pattern. When established leaders become numb to the divine, God often bypasses the hierarchy to entrust vital messages to the pure-hearted and the young. This diagram shows how God often initiates renewal from the bottom up. Because the youngest members are often the most receptive, the community must invest in their spiritual lives, recognizing that the call to lead can start well before adulthood. We have to move past the idea that spiritual authority is reserved for the mature. God can use a 7-year-old to deliver a difficult truth, or a 10-year-old to bring others to faith. The story of Samuel forces a choice between two paths. We can follow Eli into a comfortable but death apathy, or we can follow Samuel. Welcome to our study of 1 Samuel chapter 4. This passage provides a detailed account of a catastrophic military and spiritual collapse that reshaped the future of ancient Israel. At this point, the Israelites are locked in a losing war with the Philistines. A recent clash has already left 4,000 Israelite soldiers dead on the field. To reverse their fortunes, the elders of Israel make a radical decision. They send word to the sanctuary at Shiloh to have the Ark of the Covenant brought directly to the front lines. The elders say, "Let us bring the Ark, that it may come among us and save us." They aren't seeking guidance. They are treating the Ark as a physical charm, a holy relic they can deploy to force a victory through its mere presence. By moving the Ark into the center of the conflict, they turned a symbol of a covenant into a tactical tool. The stage was set for a collision, where the stakes were no longer just about territory, but the survival of their national identity. Despite the Ark's arrival, the tide does not turn. The resulting battle is a slaughter, leaving 30,000 Israelite footmen dead in the dirt. Among the thousands killed are Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of the high priest Eli. Their deaths effectively wipe out the next generation of the nation's spiritual leadership in a single afternoon. In the chaos of the retreat, the Philistines reach the center of the camp. They seize the Ark of the Covenant and carry it back to their own cities as a trophy of war. The attempt to use the divine as a military asset failed. The loss of the Ark proved that the presence it represented could not be controlled or coerced for political or tactical ends. While the army falls, the scene shifts to the city of Shiloh. Here we find Eli, the high priest. He is 98 years old, heavy with age, and his eyes are fixed in a sightless stare. Eli has taken a seat by the side of the road, listening. He is consumed by anxiety, not for the soldiers, but for the safety of the ark he allowed to be taken into battle. A Benjamite runner who escaped the slaughter arrives in the city with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. As he delivers the news, the entire city erupts in a cry of grief. Eli has governed Israel for 40 years. Now, at the end of his life, he is reduced to a spectator, waiting for the consequences of a conflict he no longer has the strength or authority to lead. The messenger reaches to blind priest and delivers the report in 4 escalating waves. First, he tells Eli that the army has fled, then that the slaughter was great. A third report strikes closer. Eli's 2 sons, the heirs to his office, are confirmed dead. Finally, the messenger delivers the ultimate blow. The Ark of God has been captured. At the mention of the Ark, Eli's body gives out. He falls backward off his seat by the gate, breaks his neck, and dies instantly. Eli had survived the news of the national defeat and the death of his children, but the loss of the Ark under his watch was the weight that finally broke him. His 40-year era of leadership ends at the exact moment the nation's most sacred symbol is lost. The tragedy ripples through Eli's household, reaching his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, who was in the final stages of pregnancy. The shock of the news, the capture of the Ark, and the deaths of both her father-in-law and her husband sends her into immediate, agonizing labor. The birth is fatal. As she lies dying, the midwives try to encourage her, telling her she has a son, but she refuses to answer or acknowledge them. With her final breath, she gives the child a name that summarizes the day. She gives the newborn boy the name Ichabod. This visual shows the meaning of the name. The glory has departed. By choosing this name, she defined the defeat not by the loss of her family, but by the departure of the divine presence from the center of their lives. The decision to use the sacred as a tactical convenience resulted in more than just a lost battle. It led to the death of a high priest, the end of a family line, and the total collapse of the sanctuary at Shiloh. By the time this video ends, you are going to have a personalized, concrete spiritual reset action plan right in front of you. We are moving past passive religious routines today. To actually hit reset, we have to expose the hidden, modern distractions quietly running in the background of your life. The framework we're using to do this comes directly from this original Bible study, unpacking the events of 1 Samuel chapter 5. So right now, grab a pen and a blank piece of paper. Seriously, pause the video if you need to. You will need them to follow along. If we don't make a physical, written commitment, spiritual growth remains an abstract idea. Let's make it a concrete reality. Step 1 starts by looking at the ancient Philistines. After defeating Israel in battle, they captured the Ark of the Covenant, treating the ultimate symbol of God's presence as a mere spoil of war. They took the Ark into the temple of Dagon, their god of agriculture and wealth. The goal was obvious: place Israel's God underneath their own belief system to show who was truly in charge. But God asserted his supremacy almost immediately. The massive statue of Dagon was found face down before the Ark, violently tipping forward and shattering into pieces on the stone floor. Severe plagues then swept through the surrounding Philistine cities, proving that God's authority easily bypassed their political borders and geographic boundaries. God's presence is fiercely holy. He absolutely refuses to be managed, co-opted, or treated as a subordinate asset by any human religious system. That brings us to step 2, the idol audit. We need to shift our focus from ancient stone statues to the invisible, modern Dagons operating in our own lives. A modern idol is exactly what you see here, the things we ultimately rely on for our security. A stone idol morphs into wealth accumulation, a rising career chart, or a glowing smartphone. Treating God of a mechanism to secure blessings is transactional faith. Inserting a prayer like a token into a vending machine will jam the gears and break the system. So ask yourself, if you lost your career, your wealth, or your social standing today, would your faith collapse? Look at your blank paper. I want you to write down your absolute must-have desire, the thing you feel you cannot live without. Now, physically draw a bold line right through it. Intentionally exposing our deepest dependencies is the only way to recognize when an earthly desire has usurped God's rightful position. Now we tackle step 3, the boundary reset. This is where we draw clear lines of separation from worldly influences. When the Philistines faced God's judgment, they didn't repent. Instead, they tried a compromise, simply moving the ark from city to city to avoid the consequences. Believers today often attempt a similar workaround. We try to dilute strict biblical truths into digestible self-help, just to avoid friction with the secular culture around us. Look at this central figure balancing these heavy, interconnected spheres. Attempting to juggle endless doom-scrolling, meaningless socializing, and toxic workplace politics is exhausting. It requires cutting out the darkest habits completely. Pick up your pen again. Identify one specific toxic distraction in your routine and write it down. You are going to completely pause this habit for the rest of the week. Attempting to accommodate worldly habits alongside God's presence always results in spiritual contamination. Holiness requires strict boundaries. Which leads us to step 4, the protocol of return. We have to learn the correct biblical response to God's discipline. On the left, we see a common trap: reacting to hardship by frantically adding more church events or religious duties. We run on a tiring hamster wheel of empty ritual without ever addressing the root sin. Contrast this with the Philistines, who stopped running, consulted priests, and returned the ark. Genuine surrender looks like the right side. It is releasing internal control over a hidden struggle, like jealousy, greed, or resentment, and letting the light back in. On your paper, write down one physical action you will take today to surrender control. This could be apologizing to someone, making a targeted donation, or deleting a specific app from your phone. God desires the vulnerability of a broken, surrendered heart over the superficial currency of religious performance. Take a look at the piece of paper in front of you. You have successfully built a personalized spiritual reset plan. You've completed 4 physical steps today: identifying your personal Dagon, rejecting transactional faith, cutting a worldly distraction, and committing to an act of surrender. This brings us back to the core lesson of 1 Samuel chapter 5. God's true presence can only fill a space once all of the false idols have been completely dismantled. Keep this written plan visible throughout your week. Do not let this remain a theory. Execute your specific action step before the day ends, because actively and intentionally taking apart your personal idols is the true pathway to building a restored, authentic spiritual foundation.
Modern life is engineered for user experience. We expect our environments, our media, and even our spiritual lives to be tailored entirely to us. But there is a hidden friction in that expectation. What happens when we project our casual, on-demand mindset onto an infinite, uncontrollable authority? This collision is laid bare on a map detailing the journey of the Ark of the Covenant. The Philistines captured the Ark, treating it as a spoil of war, a physical trophy they believed they could manipulate to prove their God's superiority. For 7 months, that assumption was violently dismantled. Their national idol, Dagon, was found shattered on the floor of its own temple, while the cities holding the Ark were severely ravaged by widespread outbreaks of tumors and sudden infestations of mice. The Philistines learned that this power could not be held captive. Forced to choose between their pride and their survival, they were left with no choice but to surrender the Ark and return it to Israel. In a desperate attempt to appease the wrath they had triggered, the Philistines prepared a guilt offering, crafting golden representations of the tumors and mice that had plagued them. Even then, they sought a way to prove if this was truly God or just a streak of bad luck. They hitched the Ark to 2 unyoked milk cows and locked their calves away, assuming the animals' maternal instincts would keep them from leaving. A moment of wonder. But the cows ignored their young and took a straight path toward the Israelite border, lowing as they went. This wasn't a random occurrence. It was a sovereign power overriding the basic biological drives of nature,
to guide the ark exactly where it intended to go. It established the first rule of the divine boundary. God is the sovereign guide of history, operating entirely on his own terms, immune to human tests. The ark eventually arrived here, in Beth Shemesh. As a Levitical city, its inhabitants were the professional guardians of the law, the very people whose vocation was defined by the protocols of the sacred. Their initial response was a joyful sacrifice, but that celebration quickly devolved into a fatal error of casual, irreverent curiosity. They looked directly into the ark, treating the absolute presence of God with the same casual familiarity one might show a common tourist attraction. The boundary was crossed, and the consequence was immediate. 70 men of the city were struck dead in a single moment. Their theological knowledge had created a false sense of safety. They assumed that because they knew the rituals, they were exempt from the requirement of trembling before the Lord. Beth Shemesh proved that knowledge without reverence is a dangerous combination. Treating the divine presence lightly remains a fatal mistake. Following the devastation, the ark was immediately relocated to the hillside home of Abinadab in Kiriath Jearim. The men here took a different approach. They intentionally consecrated Eleazar to guard the ark, re-establishing the strict boundaries that had been ignored in Beth Shemesh. Because they honored those limits, the ark's presence shifted. It was no longer an active threat to the community, but a source of enduring peace that remained with them for 20 years. Respecting the holiness of God transforms his presence. What was once a source of judgment becomes a source of profound, sustained stability. The journey of the ark shows us that while God provides a way for us to return to him, he will always defend his own glory along the way. It forces a question about our own posture. Does our approach to the divine resemble the careful, intentional guard of Kiriath Jearim, or the entitled curiosity of Beth Shemesh? The history of the ark suggests 3 pillars for a proper approach: a heart that acknowledges the weight of God's presence, a mind that submits to his word without trying to negotiate, and a life marked by deep, active humility. This humility is the active recognition that God is the sovereign creator, not a commodity designed to fulfill our wishes or fit into our modern comforts. God's presence is a power that either consumes the casual or sustains the reverent. When we remember our place and honor the boundary, the holiness that once brought judgment becomes the quiet, enduring center of a life. Ever feel like you're stuck in a loop? You hit a wall, try a new life hack, download a new app, or grasp at a quick fix, and somehow things just end up worse. You're exhausted, and the problem hasn't moved an inch. It turns out that exact feeling of being trapped in a loop is documented in an ancient text. Chapter 7 of the book of 1 Samuel records how one group of people broke out of that cycle when it seemed impossible. The frustration of failing quick fixes isn't new. It's a deeply historical problem, and the solution requires moving past the surface to address the way we've been living. Take the ancient nation of Israel. When we enter their story, they are completely cornered. They have been beaten down and lived under the heavy thumb of their enemies for decades. This chart shows exactly why they were stuck. Whenever a crisis hit, instead of turning to God, they turned to idols. These were statues of local gods that promised quick rain or easy victories. They had no actual power, which left the people right back in defeat, facing an even bigger crisis the next time around. The constant consequence of this broken cycle was a group called the Philistines. They were a massive, heavily armed neighboring empire that loomed over Israel like a storm, taking what they wanted and leaving misery an engaging wake. As long as a person, or an entire nation, looks for rescue and powerless substitutes, they guarantee their own continued oppression. This is where a leader named Samuel steps in. He gives the Israelites a blunt ultimatum. If you want real help, you have to completely abandon your fake substitutes. No more hedging your bets. They had to physically and spiritually clean house. This meant literally smashing the statues and throwing away the familiar habits that kept them trapped. They had to clear away the old to make room for God. Samuel calls everyone to gather at a town called Mizpah. The way they arrive is crucial. They don't show up in armor with swords drawn. They arrive empty-handed and go without food to show they have nothing left but their trust in God. Together, they do something incredibly rare. they admit they were wrong. There are no excuses, no pointing fingers at the Philistines. They simply say, "We have sinned against the Lord." This moment wasn't about trying to behave better. They chose to stand vulnerable before the one source of help they had ignored for years. But the moment they committed to this change, the old problem came knocking. The Philistines heard about the gathering at Mizpah. They saw a perfect target, an unarmed crowd, and immediately marched out to attack. In the past, the Israelites would have panicked and run back to their fake gods. This time, they held their ground. They begged Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us." Samuel prayed, and God responded instantly. But he bypassed conventional warfare entirely. No swords, no shields, no strategic maneuvers. The text says God thundered with a loud thunder. A massive, roaring sound from the sky struck the Philistine army. The sheer force of it threw the enemy troops into total panic and confusion. The Israelites won a complete victory. They chased the retreating army for miles, reclaiming their territory, and they did it without having to strike the first blow. When human effort is entirely surrendered, God's power proves to be the rescue they actually needed. The battle ended. The thunder faded. The dust settled, revealing a new reality for Israel. They were finally free. To make sure they never forgot exactly how this incredible rescue happened, Samuel took a single large uncarved stone. He carried it out and planted it firmly into the dirt between two towns. He called this monument Ebenezer, a name that means stone of help. It stood as a physical reminder of the power that rescued them. As he set it up, Samuel declared the meaning behind the stone. "Thus far, the Lord has helped us." That rock was necessary because human memory fades over time. When the next crisis hits, it is easy to panic and go back to old cycles. We need markers to anchor us to the truth of what has already happened. This chart shows the difference. Before this moment, their lives were a chaotic plunge into oppression, but after setting up that stone, the cycle broke. The intervention resulted in lasting stability. The Philistines stopped invading, and Israel experienced genuine peace. So what does this look like for the loops in your own life? The habits or the anxieties that never seem to actually change? The lesson is to move away from the quick fixes that fail. Look for your own Ebenezer, markers reminding you to turn away from what doesn't work and remember where true help is found.
When the systems we rely on start cracking, the immediate instinct is to panic. You look at the fracturing foundation, and the temptation is to grab whatever standard, off-the-shelf fix everyone else is using just to keep the roof from caving in. That exact panic response is the focal point of a case study found in the biblical text of 1 Samuel chapter 8. It outlines a scenario where a localized leadership structure was falling apart. At the time, ancient Israel operated on a highly unique system. They were guided directly by spiritual principles. When crises hit, localized leaders, known as judges, stepped up to handle things, but these roles were not inherited. There was no permanent royal bloodline. The crisis hits when the prophet Samuel grows old. He appoints his two sons as deputies, but they completely abandon the ethical baseline. They take bribes, chase personal wealth, and pervert justice. The system was rotting from the inside out. This creates a breaking point. When people see their foundational values being mismanaged, the fear of collapse pushes them to abandon those values entirely. They stop trying to repair the core structure and start looking for an industry-standard replacement. The local elders approach Samuel with their solution to the corruption. They demand a human king to rule over them, explicitly stating they want to be governed, quote, like all the other nations. They are trading in their unique spiritual framework for predictable, worldly security. Instead of waiting on divine timing to correct the corrupt leadership, they want the immediate safety of social conformity. The text shows Samuel taking this to God, and the response is revealing. God clarifies that the elders aren't rejecting Samuel's leadership. They are rejecting the direct governance of God himself. For the Israelites, choosing a standardized, secular model to fix a localized corruption issue meant abandoning the very thing that made them distinct. This choice created a high-stakes trade-off, trading unique spiritual agility
for the rigid stability of a neighbor's system. It forces a brutal risk assessment. You have to ask yourself what the actual long-term cost is when you choose cultural conformity over the unique calling you were supposed to maintain. God tells Samuel not to block their request. Instead, he issues a specific instruction. Grant them their choice, but strictly warn them about the inevitable price of installing a king. Think of this as a return on investment evaluation. You are weighing the perceived safety of a worldly leadership structure against the absolute physical and emotional output it demands from you to function. To map this transition, we look at the balance of freedom versus obligation. Your starting position under spiritual autonomy is high freedom and low bureaucratic burden. But the moment you opt for a rigid, centralized human authority, that position shifts into a zone of high burden and low autonomy. You surrender direct control to a system that requires strict obedience. You are giving up unique divine protection to blend in. The safety of standard societal conformity is heavy. It anchors you to the exact same limitations everyone else is dealing with. If you adopt the world's standard, you inherit the world's baseline problems. You can absolutely have what everyone else has, but you are going to pay the exact same price they do. Samuel lays out exactly what that price tag looks like. He moves past the abstract theology and lists the concrete physical realities of installing a human king.
Every secular system shares the same structural flaw. To sustain its own existence, it requires the continuous extraction of resources from the people it governs. When weighing these two options, the contrast becomes stark. You have the lightness of divine guidance on one side and the dense material weight of worldly leadership on the other. The warnings in the scripture are highly specific. A king will demand heavy taxation, he will initiate forced labor for his fields, and he will draft your children into his military. It is a systemic drain on personal property and individual liberty. The bureaucracy feeds itself first, and the light of that original freedom dims as the demands of the state multiply. The Israelites wanted a strong, united front to protect them from external threats. What they were actually signing up for was internal subjugation to human flaws, ambition, and greed. By replacing the flexibility of divine guidance with a human bureaucracy, the people invited in a system built on extraction. They traded the possibility of grace for a machine designed to prioritize its own survival over their personal autonomy. We reach the climax of chapter 8. The Israelites hear this complete list of extractions and subjugations. They understand the severity of the warnings, yet they still look Samuel in the eye and insist on having a king. God's final response to Samuel is direct. He tells the prophet to listen to the people and give them exactly what they are asking for. This is the ultimate expression of human free will. Divine authority does not step in to forcibly constrain their choice, even when that choice is highly destructive. But there is a massive caveat attached to this freedom. Absolute autonomy in your decision-making carries absolute liability for the outcome. Once you lock in a secular path, the spiritual safety net drops. You are now the sole owner of that decision, meaning you must endure 100% of the negative consequences generated by your own desires. The ancient Israelites aren't alone in this. It is incredibly easy to look at the friction in your own life or business and try to optimize it away using secular strategies. People fall into this trap in two ways. First, the pragmatic optimizer. Making structural decisions based on panic sets you up for long-term crushing weight. Second, the values-driven leader. Compromising spiritual anchors to hit industry standards. Refusing that crown is difficult when everyone wears one. The tragic irony of Israel's choice is glaring. In their rush to escape the temporary, localized corruption of Samuel's sons, they locked themselves into the permanent, multi-generational oppression of a monarchy. Sovereignty in our own decision-making comes down to the framework we allow to dictate our choices. We are always accountable to some standard. The challenge is identifying which one actually aligns with our long-term goals. Divine guidance hands you the pen to write your own story, but it does not allow you to edit the consequences once the ink dries. If you attempt to replace principled living with human pragmatism, be prepared. You will ultimately get exactly what you ask for:
down to the final exhausting detail. There is an unavoidable tax on your personal peace and spiritual freedom that comes with a life optimized strictly for worldly acceptance. It will always extract more than it provides. The most consequential freedom is found in selecting an authority that preserves our agency, rather than one that eventually demands it back as payment.
We all know the feeling of pouring everything you have into a problem only to end up exactly where you started. You spend days spinning your wheels on an endless list of frustrating, repetitive chores, completely exhausted. When we hit these walls, our natural instinct is to just grip the steering wheel tighter. We assume that if we push a little harder, our sheer willpower will eventually break through the roadblock. It turns out that specific brand of modern burnout is thousands of years old. You can find a perfect mirror for it in the 9th chapter of 1 Samuel. When our heads are down and we're entirely focused on the immediate frustration of the day, that ground-level view keeps us from seeing any larger design at work. Long before he wore a crown, Saul was just a guy dealing with a massive headache of a family chore. His father's livestock had wandered off, and in the ancient pastoral economy, that meant Saul had to drop everything to go find them. This map shows the geography of the ancient Holy Land, divided by the 12 tribes. Saul dragged himself and his servant across this rugged, unforgiving terrain, through the hill country of Ephraim, through Shalisha and Shalim, turning up absolutely nothing. He spent days burning through his energy and resources. Running entirely on his own internal compass, he led himself straight into a dead end. Eventually, the exhaustion wins out. Saul stops trying to force it and decides to call off the search entirely before his father starts worrying about them instead of the animals. Right at that moment of surrender, his servant chimes in with an alternative. Rather than trusting their own tracking abilities anymore, he suggests they go into the nearby town and ask a man of God, the prophet Samuel, for direction. Notice how narrow Saul's focus is here. He is evaluating this entire multi-day ordeal strictly as a massive waste of time and a heavy financial loss for his family. But the text pulls the camera back to reveal something else. A full 24 hours before Saul even arrived at that town, God had already told Samuel exactly who was coming to see him. Saul's breakthrough finally came when he abandoned his self-reliant hunt to seek the prophet's insight. This brings us to a specific theological concept called providence. Providence is the idea that God actively uses normal, everyday circumstances, even the highly frustrating ones, to weave together his sovereign plans. This animated timeline of Saul's journey appears to be pure chaos, zigzags driven by wandering animals. But underneath is precision. The animals wandered at a specific hour, and Saul failed in specific regions, to arrive exactly where a prophet waited. This orchestration happens even in the middle of human failure. Prior to this, the people of Israel had explicitly demanded a king so they could be like their neighbors, effectively rejecting God's direct rule. Yet even that rebellion couldn't derail the sovereign timing of these events. Now Saul does get the crown, but the historical record shows that he became a deeply troubled, insecure, and ultimately broken ruler. His reign was a messy stopgap. God was using this unstable monarchy to lay the groundwork for the Davidic line, building a bridge toward a permanent kingdom. Saul stumbled into his anointing completely by accident while tracking down some stubborn livestock. But centuries later, Jesus Christ arrived deliberately, carrying a very specific mandate. The first king was an imperfect man desperately trying to find lost animals. He serves as a shadow pointing to a perfect ruler who intentionally stepped into history to seek and save lost humanity. So what do we do with this text on a Tuesday afternoon? First, you stay faithful in the mundane. If Saul hadn't fully committed to the deeply unglamorous job of tracking his father's herd, he never would have intersected with the prophet. Second, you pay attention to the small voices around you. Guidance often comes from the most overlooked sources. It was a nameless servant, not a high official, who steered Saul towards his calling. And most importantly, you have to know when to drop the blind hustle. Before you burn through the last reserves of your own willpower, stop and actually ask God for clarity. Genuine obedience doesn't mean just gritting your teeth and pushing through the exhaustion. It means recognizing your own limits, pausing the frantic search, and aligning your steps with the one who wrote the script. Imagine being unexpectedly selected for a massive promotion or a highly visible leadership role. For a lot of us, the very first instinct isn't to celebrate, it's to crawl right under the desk and hide. This chart shows what psychologists call imposter syndrome. We have a massive column on the left representing what other people expect of us, towering over a tiny, shrinking column on the right, which is our own internal confidence. We tend to treat this severe mismatch as a modern problem, born in corporate offices and university halls. But the terror of feeling wildly inadequate is an ancient, deeply human struggle. We see it clearly in the biblical account of 1 Samuel chapter 10. The story follows a man named Saul, who is tapped to become the very first king of Israel. Saul's story suggests that the very feeling of being unqualified doesn't have to be the end of the road. It might actually be the beginning. Before anyone called him a king, Saul was dealing with a deeply frustrating errand. He was not out campaigning for a throne. He was wandering the countryside on a boring, dead-end search for his father's lost donkeys. That mundane detail reveals how divine guidance often works. It usually bypasses dramatic, sweeping events and uses our most ordinary daily frustrations to steer us into position. While Saul is stuck on this wild goose chase, the prophet Samuel pulls him aside in private. Samuel delivers the news. Saul is destined to lead the entire nation. Samuel gives Saul a timeline with 3 signs to prove his calling. First, Saul will hear the donkeys are found. Second, strangers will hand him 2 loaves of bread. The final sign is different. Encountering prophets, Saul will be overcome by the Holy Spirit. The text describes this as Saul being given a new heart. He is being reshaped from the inside out, gaining a sense of steady resolve that he didn't naturally possess. In this biblical framework, true leadership is a gift from God's Spirit. It is specifically designed to equip the unqualified, rather than acting as a reward for existing human talent. The private meetings conclude, and the scene shifts to a town called Mizpah. The entire nation gathers together. The stakes are incredibly high, and the people are buzzing with anticipation to meet their first monarch. Samuel initiates a public selection process. They draw lots, narrowing the choice down tribe by tribe and clan by clan, until the final lot falls officially on Saul. The crowd looks around, fully prepared to cheer for their new sovereign. But there is a glaring problem. The king is nowhere to be found. They finally discover the newly appointed king cowering among the nation's luggage. He is hiding in a chaotic pile of travel sacks and woven baskets. When the people pull him out from the supplies, he makes quite an impression. Physically, Saul is head and shoulders taller than everyone else in the crowd. He possesses the towering royal stature everyone expects. Yet beneath that impressive exterior is a man paralyzed by hesitation, choosing retreat over responsibility. This contradiction foreshadows his later failures. You can have the height, the look, and a clear calling, but external advantages cannot sustain a leader who allows internal doubt and fear to rule them. Most of us don't live in ancient Israel, but we all deal with our own versions of lost donkeys. We face deeply annoying interruptions and detours that derail our daily plans. When those unexpected detours happen, it helps to maintain a positive mindset. The very frustration you want to avoid is often the exact mechanism guiding you toward your next opportunity. Stepping into a massive new role means recognizing that your current skills and habits might not be enough. You have to be willing to let your inner self be reshaped to handle the task. It is completely human to feel terrified. Wanting to shrink back into your comfort zone when heavy expectations drop on your shoulders is a natural reaction. The defining question is how you respond to that fear. When the path you're on finally leads to a moment where you're asked to lead, will you step out or will you stay hidden in the baggage? Grounded and sober. In 1 Samuel 11, the Israelites were not just facing a military crisis on a shadowy battlefield. They were confronting a deep-seated existential fear that had been building for a generation. For 2 decades, the nation had avoided major conflict. They were a people out of practice, living in the long shadow of their last catastrophic encounter. This chart captures the scale of that previous disaster. During the battle against the Philistines, 34,000 men were killed, and their most sacred symbol, the Ark of the Covenant, was captured.
20 years without a victory had done more than deplete their army. It had eroded their collective confidence. They had become a nation that expected to lose. This vulnerability is what Nahash the Ammonite exploited when he brought his forces against the city of Jabesh. It was a sudden siege against a town with no means of defense. Nahash didn't just want the territory. He demanded that every man have his right eye gouged out.
He wanted to turn the Telthuration into a permanent, living monument to Israel's weakness. The response from the elders of Jabesh reveals the depth of their despair. Instead of preparing for a desperate stand, they immediately offered to serve Nahash if he would only make a treaty with them. The memory of their past failures had effectively blinded them before Nahash ever could. They saw surrender as the only realistic option because they no longer accounted for the possibility of intervention. The news eventually reached the town of Gibeah. As Saul heard the report, the text describes the Spirit of God coming upon him, triggering a massive wave of anger. Saul stood a full head taller than his peers, but in this moment it was his resolve rather than his height that set him apart. While the nation wept, Saul prepared for war. To snap the people out of their stupor, Saul used a brutal, unmistakable visual. He took 2 oxen, slaughtered them, and cut them into pieces. He sent those pieces to every corner of the map with a message. Anyone who did not follow him and the prophet Samuel into battle would see their own livestock meet the same fate. This map shows the result of that ultimatum. The text notes that God placed a specific dread over the people. It wasn't a gentle nudge, it was a sudden, multiplying force that moved the nation to act as a single unit. When a culture has spent 20 years learning how to give up, God utilized a shock to the system. He used a visceral, terrifying moment to override their habit of surrender. The mobilization was massive. Within a day, 330,000 men gathered, ready to march on the Ammonite camp. This chart visualizes the coalition. Saul successfully drew 300,000 men from the northern tribes of Israel and 30,000 from Judah, uniting the entire region for the first time in years. Saul led this army on a stealthy, rapid march through the darkness. They covered the distance under the cover of night, reaching the enemy lines before the sun was fully up. The morning ambush was absolute. The Ammonite camp was so thoroughly scattered that the biblical account notes no 2 soldiers were left together by noon. In less than 24 hours, the military stagnation of the last 2 decades was gone, replaced by a total and decisive victory. The contrast is stark. The day started with the Israelites weeping and negotiating the terms of their own mutilation, and ended with those same men standing over a defeated enemy. This victory served as the final confirmation of Saul's leadership. He had not just won a battle, he had proven he could mobilize and lead a fractured people under pressure. What is striking here is the timing. The rescue of Jabesh was set in motion while the people were still resigned to their defeat. The momentum shifted because of a divine initiative that caught the people by surprise. It shows that God's intent to deliver his people isn't waiting for a perfect environment or a surge in national morale. He can execute a promise even when the recipients are at their lowest point of readiness. Most of us still operate like the elders of Jabesh. We look at our bank accounts, our past failures, or our current energy levels and conclude that progress is impossible. We treat our environment as the final word on our potential. But the pattern in 1 Samuel suggests a different approach. When we stop weighing the obstacles and simply respond to the command, the resources we need often appear as we move. The provision follows the obedience. God communicates with those who are looking for a way forward. By following his word closely and moving quickly, we can see long-standing patterns of stagnation broken in a single moment. When panic sets in, human beings have a highly predictable reflex. We immediately try to construct our own safety nets. We look for something we can touch, measure, or follow to block out the anxiety and give ourselves the illusion of control. Ancient Israel reached that exact breaking point at the close of the era of the Judges. Exhausted by constant threats, they decided to crown their first human king, staging what felt like a definitive national triumph. Looking at this isolated Canaanite landscape, their anxiety makes perfect sense. This is a dry, unforgiving valley surrounded by hostile borders.
Survival here meant you were constantly vulnerable to the environment and to sudden raids. So they sought tangible protection. They wanted heavy bronze helmets, forged swords, and a centralized standing army led by a monarch to keep the terror at bay. But this political upgrade was a mirage. They traded an invisible creator for the brittle security of Bronze Age geopolitics. Right in the middle of the coronation festivities, the prophet Samuel halts the celebration. By establishing his uncorrupted record, he secures the moral authority required for the indictment he is about to deliver. Samuel abruptly forces the entire nation to look backward, detailing every cycle of their history since leaving Egypt. The pattern is glaring. God repeatedly intervenes to rescue them, and humanity reliably abandons him the moment the crisis fades. This diagram illustrates their treason. By demanding a king, they severed their direct reliance on divine rule, replacing it with a human hierarchy. But this new structure is incredibly fragile. Institutionalizing rebellion blinded them, exposing them to severe divine judgment. Earthly systems cannot patch a spiritual deficit. The actual threat wasn't across the border. It was written right into their new constitution. To prove this, Samuel does something terrifying. He turns to the sky and asks God to violently disrupt the natural order, targeting a highly specific, vulnerable moment in the calendar. This photograph captures the Canaanite wheat harvest. In this region, late spring and early summer are bone dry. Rain during the harvest is an absolute meteorological anomaly, one that would rot the golden wheat and destroy the entire year's food supply. Without warning, the clear, arid sky fractures. A violent thunderstorm erupts over the desert, tearing through the coronation with deafening thunder and torrential rain. The sudden arrival of the storm reveals God's active sovereignty over the natural world, transforming a localized harvest into a theater of divine holiness. When the invisible creator decides to move, he effortlessly overrides the visible world. Their human timelines, their harvest schedules, and political borders are suddenly rendered utterly powerless. The national celebration instantly disintegrates. The Israelites stare at their newly crowned monarch and realize his bronze weapons cannot fight the weather. The masses collapse face down in the mud. The deafening thunder completely strips away their arrogance, violently curing their spiritual blindness in a matter of seconds. As the rain beats down, the absurdity of their choice becomes agonizingly clear. They had willingly traded the Almighty God who controls the cosmos for a fragile political institution that can't even stop a downpour. Humanity rarely surrenders its illusions of control without a fight. It often takes a catastrophic shock to force us to look closely at our own rebellion, exposing our complete spiritual nakedness. To truly recognize our desperate need for God, the idols we build have to be completely stripped of their power. The Israelites are left shivering in the dirt. They fully expect to be annihilated by the storm, and they know, with absolute certainty, they deserve it. But instead of a final strike of lightning, the narrative sharply pivots. Samuel steps into the chaos, looks at the terrified crowd, and tells them not to fear. Despite their treason, the prophet refuses to walk away. He commits to standing by this broken community, vowing to never stop praying for them. Samuel's vow to stand in the breach between a holy God and a rebellious nation establishes the pattern of mediation. This bridge draws two opposing realities together, prefiguring the intercession of Jesus Christ, who occupies the gap for a world in revolt. Justice and mercy meet in the middle of the rain. Because a mediator occupies the gap, a moment of certain destruction becomes a gateway for grace. God chooses not to cast his people away. And crucially, this rescue isn't a reward for good behavior or a promise to reform. The text states he saves them for his great name's sake. Their salvation is anchored entirely in his own character, proving that rescue relies strictly on proactive, unmerited grace. Look at these crumbling ruins. They are a physical reminder that every earthly kingdom, every financial safeguard, and every political savior will eventually decay. We have to stop expecting visible systems to provide ultimate security. Instead of frantically building our own defenses, we can adopt the posture of Samuel. We can act as spiritual watchmen, choosing to relentlessly pray for our imperfect communities rather than abandoning them. The thunder eventually fades, but the grace that enveloped the unworthy remains as the story's enduring legacy.
When the pressure is on and deadlines are tightening, your instincts scream at you to act immediately. But reacting blindly to a high-stress situation often makes the crisis worse. Before we go any further, grab a pen and a piece of paper. Right now, write down one specific pending decision you are actively struggling to make. Keep it right in front of you. We are going to evaluate that decision using a historical framework. 1 Samuel chapter 13 provides an exacting masterclass on the disastrous results of acting on semen ambition without divine guidance. By the end of this video, you will use this text to build a 3-point discernment filter. We are going to test your decision to ensure your next move is driven by clear command rather than anxious ambition. Let's start building. Draw a vertical line down your paper. On the left side, write advantage, and on the right side, write limitation. We have to establish the baseline power dynamics. In 1 Samuel 13, the Israelites faced an asymmetric threat. The Philistines maintained overwhelming dominance by holding a strict monopoly on iron forging technology. The Israelites were out-leveraged before the fight even began. Looking at this high-tech manufacturing floor, we see the modern equivalent. Today's power imbalances happen through control of critical global supply chains, like microchips and rare earth metals. If a competitor controls the technology, they control the field. This scale of global logistics shows the same asymmetry. Large organizations use the massive scale of international trade and energy control to build leverage and outmaneuver smaller competitors. You need to map out your own limitations against your competitors' advantages. Ask yourself if your urge to make this decision is actually a fearful reaction to feeling out-leveraged. Underneath your chart, write our first test. Filter 1. Convenience versus command. In verse 3, Jonathan takes 1,000 men and attacks the Philistine garrison at Geba. The text notes the location specifically. Geba sat right next to Gibeah. Without a specific command, tactical proximity looks like an open invitation to act. This is the failure point. The attack was a rogue act of zeal. Jonathan acted without explicit instruction from his father or from God. There is a common trap in leadership, assuming that having the resources, the manpower, and an open door means you have a mandate to act. Power and opportunity do not equal instruction. Convenience is often a trap. An easy, accessible path should never be taken unless you have clear, divine instruction validating the move. Next, write down Filter 2, Fact versus Fiction. Look at your pending decision and aggressively cross out any driving factors that are based on assumptions. During a crisis, a leader's mind is flooded with unverified rumors, panic, and noise. Navigating that chaos demands clarity, not reaction. Saul fell victim to this noise in verses 3 and 4. He mobilized the entire nation of Israel based almost entirely on hearsay, specifically hearing rumors that the Philistines despised them. He went to war over a mood. Look at how this tactical room operates. Strategic planning requires strict, verifiable intelligence. You evaluate hard data on the monitors in front of you, entirely separated from gut feelings or hearsay. True spiritual discernment requires you to filter out the noise of anxiety and rumors. Ground your next move strictly in undeniable facts. Finally, write down our last test. Filter 3, Obedience over Optics. Verses 8 through 14 details Saul's absolute breaking point. His troops were actively scattering, the prophet Samuel was late, the timeline was expiring, and the king panicked. To stop the desertion and save face with his remaining army, Saul bypassed God's direct command and offered the burnt sacrifice himself. Impatience creates a devastating psychological trap. When the clock is ticking, leaders often compromise their foundational principles just to maintain the outward appearance of control. Saul's reign broke here. Prioritizing the immediate optics of leadership over strict obedience to a divine timeline always results in a permanent loss of authority. Look down at the paper in front of you. You have successfully built a complete 3-point discernment filter. Running your decisions through these 3 specific tests
forces a chaotic situation into a structured framework, separating your personal ambition from external instructions. I want to challenge you on the decision you wrote down. If your urge to act is driven by convenience, fueled by rumors, or rushed by the need to look in control, stop. You must wait. This text provides an operational standard for leadership. 1 Samuel 13 serves as the structural foundation for effective decision-making under pressure. By utilizing this filter, you stop reacting out of blind human ambition. You move forward with the precise clarity of divine instruction.
When an organization or a nation faces an existential threat, the true nature of its leadership is instantly exposed. To understand exactly how extreme pressure fractures command, we can look at a case study in crisis management found in the historical text of 1 Samuel chapter 14. This diagram shows a massive Philistine military force rapidly suffocating a tiny, isolated pocket of Israelites. The defending army is outgunned and overwhelmingly outnumbered. That severe imbalance in firepower creates a crushing psychological weight. The vast majority of the Israelite camp is paralyzed, their morale has collapsed, and a deep-seated fear has locked the entire army into a state of frozen inaction. Trapped inside this pressure cooker are two central figures holding authority: King Saul, the nominal head of state, and his son, Prince Jonathan, who operates as a field commander. This dynamic presents an interesting case study in lineage. While people often assume a leader's character and response to stress are strictly inherited, the outcome of this specific crisis suggests that a son's actions can diverge sharply from his father's precedents. Both men are staring at the exact same encroaching enemy. By tracking how each of them processes this identical threat, we can identify the specific mechanics that separate a fear-driven panic from effective, faithful execution. Let's look at the son's approach first. While the entire camp suffers from a collective collapse in morale, Jonathan refuses to adopt their defensive posture. He rejects the paralysis. His mental framework is different. Instead of auditing the enemy's superior weaponry, Jonathan views the opposition through a strict spiritual lens. He refers to the Philistines as the uncircumcised, leaning into his own standing with God rather than dwelling on a hardware deficit. This framing drives his strategy. As we see in this diagram, Jonathan splits off from the main paralyzed force. He initiates a calculated stealth offensive, and he takes exactly one person with him, his armor-bearer. He bases this maneuver on the belief that when God acts, victory is detached from troop counts. As his armor-bearer agrees to the plan and twists together with him into a single unit, their alignment creates a highly concentrated force of two. The tactical result is immediate. This tiny strike team strikes the larger force, catching them off guard. The Philistine lines fracture, panic spreads, and the overwhelming army begins collapsing into absolute chaos. This outcome suggests that when a large group is locked in a defensive crouch, the path forward is often cleared not by the crowd, but by the specific, calculated action of a unified minority. Meanwhile, back at the main camp, we have to look at how King Saul is handling that exact same window of time. Saul lacks Jonathan's grounded confidence. Feeling the pressure of command slipping away, he tries to manufacture authority. He bypasses actual strategy and defaults to a religious performance to create the appearance of control. To force a sense of urgency, Saul issues a reactionary military order. He binds his own troops with a strict oath, legally forbidding a single soldier from consuming any food until the battle is completely won. You cannot run a combat operation on 0 calories. A heavy fog of fatigue immediately settles over the Israelite army. The men suffer from physical exhaustion, their vision blurs, and their ability to fight drops to near zero. Jonathan, however, was out in the field and never heard his father's decree. Coming across some wild honey in the forest, he eats. Almost instantly as he consumes it, his physical energy returns and his mental clarity sharpens. When he rejoins the main force and sees the physical state of the men, Jonathan realizes the consequence of the order. His father's attempt to look like a strong leader has actively hindered the army's ability to capitalize on the victory they were just handed. Ego-driven mandates dictated by panic do not produce discipline.
They bind, exhaust, and ultimately blind the very people they are intended to lead. So, what is the underlying engine driving this difference in performance? Why does the son move with courage, while the father spins into counterproductive panic? The text points to their respective foundations. Jonathan operates from a direct, personal working knowledge of God's character. Saul is merely leaning on the optics of religion, going through the motions without an internal anchor. That distinction is relevant today. Modern believers find themselves in a similar position to Jonathan, operating as a minority facing a wall of cultural opposition.
In that environment, a primary vulnerability is a reliance on second-hand faith. This diagram illustrates what happens when you outsource your spiritual understanding. If you rely entirely on external commentators or philosophers to interpret the text for you, the original truth passes through the filters of their opinions. By the time it reaches you, the signal is fragmented. The fix is to bypass the middleman. To build real operational confidence, you must read the text of the Bible directly, studying the mechanics of its promises and understanding its positions for yourself. This brings us back to that moment in the woods. Jonathan's physical recovery wasn't accidental. It was the direct result of consuming the honey himself. Similarly, courage isn't an abstract feeling, but a byproduct of a mind that has personally digested the specific promises found in the source. Securing victory means stepping out of the cycle of empty, exhausting performance. You don't have to starve under the frantic rulings of others. You simply have to be willing to taste the truth for yourself. Imagine securing the most decisive military victory of your life and losing your kingdom before the dust even settles. The historical record in 1 Samuel 15 documents a brutal, ongoing geographic border conflict between ancient Israel and the Amalekites. To settle it, Israel's first monarch, King Saul, is handed a highly specific military objective. The prophet Samuel delivers the mission parameters directly from God. They are absolute: the complete annihilation of the Amalekite civilization. There is no room for interpretation here. 0 exceptions, no prisoners taken, and absolutely no plunder permitted. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, this defies standard operating procedure. Armies fought for the spoils. Capturing high-value hostages and looting livestock was the primary economic engine used to fund your military and pay your soldiers. As King Saul marches his troops into the desert, he faces a collision of logic. He has to choose whether to execute the unyielding parameters of the divine command or optimize the situation using standard human military practice. The military objective is secondary. This specific deployment is designed as a pure stress test of absolute allegiance. Saul mobilizes a massive force and executes a flawless surprise ambush against the Amalekites. The tactical success is overwhelming. In the initial phase, Saul follows the parameters. His troops devastate the settlements, destroying the general populace and burning anything deemed weak or worthless. Saul makes a calculated pivot, deliberately sparing the Amalekite leader King Agag to parade as a political trophy. Next, they audit the livestock, destroying sickly animals but preserving premium herds. A literal gap opens between this strict divine command and Saul's actual execution. A victorious army expects a payout. Enriching your troops with top-tier livestock is the fastest, most efficient way to secure their long-term loyalty. From Saul's perspective, a 99% completion rate looks like a total victory. In reality, he has substituted divine instruction with human optimization, completely failing the core mission. Behind the scenes, God immediately rejects Saul's compromise. The prophet Samuel is sent to intercept the king, arriving at an Israelite camp deep in celebration. Saul confidently marches up to Samuel, proudly declaring that he has carried out the Lord's instructions. But his words clash entirely with the undeniable sound of thousands of stolen sheep bleating in the background. Caught, Saul scrambles for a defense mechanism. He argues the troops preserved the premium livestock intentionally, planning to offer them as magnificent sacrifices to God. Samuel dismantles the argument on the spot. He delivers a devastating critique. To obey is better than to sacrifice, and to listen is better than the fat of rams. Taking a direct command, retrofitting it to your economic preferences, and masking it as religious devotion is not worship, it's rebellion.
Backed into a corner, Saul finally confesses the underlying math of his decision. He feared the demands and opinions of his own soldiers more than he respected the command of God. Samuel delivers the final, unalterable judgment. Because Saul rejected the word of the divine, he is permanently rejected as king. Samuel turns to leave. In a frantic panic, Saul lunges forward and grabs the edge of the prophet's robe, pulling hard enough to rip the heavy fabric straight down the middle. Samuel looks at the ruined garment and turns it into a permanent visual metaphor, declaring that the Lord has irrevocably torn the kingdom of Israel from Saul this very day. Stepping in to close the gap Saul left open, Samuel personally executes King Agag, brutally finalizing the mission parameters the king lacked the resolve to complete. The prophet turns his back and walks away, severing ties of the rest of his life. Saul is left standing alone in the dust of a hollow, incomplete victory. For the sake of a temporary economic payout and the fleeting approval of his troops, Saul traded away a permanent, generational dynasty. In the realm of absolute commands, partial obedience equals complete disobedience. Human logic might win the battle, but it will lose the crown.
We spend our lives building our resumes. We chase titles, climb pedestals, and curate an outward image to prove our worth to the world. But a single chapter in the book of 1 Samuel challenges how we measure value. It suggests that the metrics we use to evaluate a leader are often looking at the wrong things. The story begins during a national crisis in ancient Israel. The nation's first king, Saul, looks like a savior. He is tall, physically imposing, and by all external measures, he is exactly what a desperate country expects in a king. Yet underneath the armor, Saul's character is decaying. He has repeatedly prioritized his public standing over his instructions, choosing his own pride over the requirements of his office. Because of this persistent rebellion, God rejects Saul's kingship. The throne is occupied, but a spiritual vacuum has opened. It must be filled by someone with an entirely different kind of preparation. It establishes a reality that would haunt Saul's reign, a leader who projects strength on the outside but lacks spiritual integrity on the inside is disqualified from the start. To find this new king, God sends the prophet Samuel to the small hillside town of Bethlehem to visit a man named Jesse. Jesse brings forward his oldest son, Eliab. He is tall, strong, and confident, the very image of the king the people first asked for. Even Samuel, a seasoned prophet, takes one look at Eliab and assumes this impressive figure must be the chosen one. But God corrects him. He tells Samuel to ignore Eliab's height and appearance. People judge by the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. One by one, Jesse brings 7 of his capable sons before Samuel, and one by one, they are passed over. The family hadn't even invited the youngest son to the gathering. David was out in the rocky fields, doing the unseen, mundane labor of a shepherd. When David is finally summoned, God identifies him as the one. By choosing the son tasked with the lonely, daily responsibility of the flock, God signals that he is looking for the faithfulness developed in the quiet of the pasture rather than the polish of the palace. This shift challenges how society assigns value. True qualification doesn't necessarily come from public prestige. It is often rooted in the integrity built when no one is watching. After David is anointed, their spiritual paths diverge. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, replacing his peace with deep, persistent torment. On the side, the Spirit of God rests on the young shepherd, empowering him for the weight of his calling. David eventually finds himself in the palace, but not as a king, as a servant. He is brought in to play the lyre for Saul, using his music to soothe the very man he is destined to replace. The man on the throne is left powerless in his own home, while spiritual authority rests with the shepherd who is content to serve him. Even after his anointing, David does not immediately claim the crown. He simply goes back to his sheep. He returns to the obscure, repetitive work of the pasture. This is where character is tested, in the time spent waiting, trusting that the work done in the shadows is preparing him for what is to come. This pattern of choosing the overlooked shepherd echoes through history.
It foreshadows the arrival of David's descendant, Jesus, another king who entered the world in obscurity and served before he reigned. This narrative asks us to look at our own lives. Are we judging our worth by the standards of a worldly resume? If you are in a season of waiting, are you willing to serve where you are, trusting the preparation that happens when no one is providing recognition? We are called to stop measuring by outward appearances and to focus instead on cultivating a heart that is ready to be used.
1 Samuel 17 provides a technical blueprint for how to confront paralyzing, impossible fear. It is a study of human limitation under the pressure of a mathematically superior threat. The context is a 40-day deadlock in a valley. During this time, the Israelite military, led by King Saul, underwent a total psychological collapse. This diagram illustrates their terror. Compared to the average soldier, Goliath stood a towering 2.9 meters tall. His equipment was equally overwhelming: a 57-kilogram bronze breastplate and a 7-kilogram iron spearhead. This massive defense vastly outweighed the Israelite infantry's offensive capacity. This physical disparity neutralized King Saul. As an earthly leader, he evaluated the threat using purely human metrics of power and found his army lacking. When military dominance and worldly resources are a leader's only metrics, they are defenseless against a force that simply has more of them. David arrives at the front lines as an outsider. He carries no weapons, making him look entirely out of place in a professional military encampment. He finds an army motivated by fear and greed. The soldiers are obsessed with the rewards Saul has promised: wealth, royal marriage, and tax exemptions for the man who kills the giant. David, however, is driven by the insult Goliath has leveled at the name of God. He views the giant not as a military problem to be solved for profit, but as a theological challenge to God's honor. His willingness to fight isn't based on a sudden burst of adrenaline. It is rooted in a history of private trials that the army never saw. In the wilderness, David's pastoral duties were a matter of survival. He had already faced lions and bears to protect his flock, using those moments to test his reliance on divine protection. He complemented this trust with relentless discipline, spending years perfecting the speed and accuracy required to hit a moving target with a sling. Spiritual courage is the product of this combination: daily physical discipline and a history of relying on God through previous, smaller trials. Before David enters the valley, King Saul attempts to equip him according to standard military protocol. Saul places his own heavy royal bronze armor onto the shepherd boy. By attempting to use this armor, David would be relying on the same human strategies and physical defenses that had already failed the rest of the army for 40 days. David rejects the armor and chooses these tools instead. We see the 5 smooth stones and leather sling he took from the brook. These stones represent a total shift in strategy, from a reliance on human engineering to a reliance on God's power. David boldly faces Goliath and declares that he fights entirely in the name of the Lord of hosts. With a single stone, he bypasses the giant's bronze and iron defenses, ending the battle instantly. This victory demonstrates that faith does not merely compete with worldly power, it renders even the most advanced human defenses obsolete. The resolution of the fight reveals a specific truth about the nature of authority. The 40-day deadlock happened because the Israelite army and its king had lost sight of who was actually in command. While Saul held the title of king, he was merely an earthly executor. David succeeded because he recognized that the Lord of hosts remained the actual commander and the true king of the army. In our own lives, we face modern giants, circumstances or challenges that seemed physically and mathematically impossible to overcome. When we face them, we have to choose our equipment. Are we trying to fight using Saul's armor, relying on money, seeking out status, or human approval? Or are we trusting the strength that has carried us through our past? In any struggle, victory belongs to God. It is granted to those who fight not for their own personal advancement, but for the glory of the true King. Imagine landing the biggest client of your career.
You walk into the office expecting praise, but your boss looks at you with a coldness that feels a lot more like hostility than pride. This tension, the fear that a subordinate's success might somehow diminish the person in charge, is a recurring theme throughout history. We find a clear example of this dynamic in the biblical account of 1 Samuel chapter 18. The setting is ancient Israel. A shepherd named David has just achieved a massive victory by defeating the Philistine champion, Goliath. The win is so decisive that the entire nation is swept up in celebration. But as the army returns, the celebration hits a nerve. The local women start singing a song with a specific lyric. Saul kills his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. King Saul hears the comparison and is instantly furious. Saul stopped seeing a victorious general and started seeing a rival.
The way a leader handles that specific moment, when the person they hired starts to eclipse them, determines whether the entire structure holds together or begins to crack. Look at this scale representing Saul's perspective. He views David's military victories through a zero-sum lens. In Saul's mind, if David's reputation rises, his own authority must be pushed down by the exact same margin. Driven by this paranoia, Saul devises a trap. He offers his daughter Michal to David in marriage, but sets the bride price as a dangerous military mission against the Philistines. He is intentionally sending his top performer into an impossible situation, hoping David dies in battle. This mirrors a documented pattern in modern organizations, threatened managers assigning doomed projects or unachievable quotas to high performers, attempting to tarnish a reputation they can no longer compete with. The plot backfires. David completes the mission, and Michal genuinely falls in love with him. Instead of being eliminated, David becomes even more deeply integrated into the royal house and the hearts of the people. When envy takes over, a leader's logic begins to fail. They end up actively sabotaging the very military successes that keep their own kingdom safe, all to protect a sense of individual standing. However, there is a different response within the same family. Saul's son and heir, Prince Jonathan, watches the exact same victory over Goliath and responds with immediate respect for David's ability. Jonathan takes off his royal robe, his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt, and hands them over to David. In the ancient world, this transfer of personal gear represents a profound alliance. By handing over his armor, the prince is stepping out of a competition for dominance. He recognizes that David's strength doesn't diminish his own royal standing, it reinforces the security of the future they both share. Jonathan demonstrates how secure leadership functions. Instead of measuring his own status against David's, he views David's rise as a direct benefit to the team's total strength. While Saul's rivalry drove his best fighter into exile, Jonathan's response turned a potential competitor into a loyal ally who would eventually protect the kingdom's legacy. The historical account shows that Saul's obsession led to his own moral and mental decline. David's reputation continued to grow despite the king's interference, eventually leaving Saul isolated and without authority. As the story shows, attempting to suppress high-level talent is a losing game. Saul's resistance didn't stop David. It only accelerated Saul's own loss of public trust and authority. Applying the logic of these two paths leads to a few clear principles for managing high-level talent today. First, consider the rewards. When a subordinate handles a major crisis, the entire department's stock rises. Secure leaders make sure that victory is acknowledged generously, knowing that a rising star reflects well on the person who put them in that position. Second, look for opportunities to sponsor. Like Jonathan, give the rising stars the access and tools they need to go further. This turns a potential rival into a permanent ally who is invested in your continued success. And finally, keep the ego in check. When outsiders compare you to your team, saying a subordinate did tens of thousands, it isn't a personal insult. When you look at the total area of the chart, those numbers combine into your team's collective capacity. Great leaders do not build traps to contain their best people. They build stages for them to stand on. An iron-tipped spear hurtling across the room at a loyal servant is more than a momentary lapse in judgment. It is the evidence of a promise that had no foundation. Just days prior, King Saul had sworn a solemn oath to protect David. Now he is trying to pin him to the wall. This sequence in 1 Samuel 19 maps the volatile intersection of unrepentant human psychology and the layers of intervention required to counter it. The crisis begins with Saul's growing paranoia. He no longer sees David as his most successful commander, but as a threat to be neutralized, issuing a direct decree to his son and his servants to have David killed. Saul's son, Jonathan, attempts to disrupt this descent. He uses a reasoned, logical defense to confront his father, pointing to David's innocence and his history of service to the crown. The argument succeeds, at least on the surface. Saul relents, formally swearing that as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. That the peace is short-lived. An oath made without an internal change of heart is merely a temporary lid on a boiling vessel. Without genuine repentance, the old patterns of sin inevitably resurface, more violent than before. When underlying corruption is unaddressed, internal pressure builds against superficial vows. A promise cannot hold if the spirit remains unchanged. Eventually, that pressure shatters the barrier. Saul's jealousy returns with enough force to send David fleeing into the night, escaping another spear. The king doubles down, sending a team of assassins to David's home with orders to wait for morning light to strike. As the physical threat escalates, the mode of protection changes. God utilizes Saul's own daughter, Michal, to subvert the king's orders from within his own family. Michal orchestrates a midnight escape, lowering David out a window and down the side of the house to slip past the waiting guards. Where Jonathan used reasoned logic to appeal to the king's mind, Michal uses urgent physical defiance to secure David's safety. These interventions show God leveraging the diverse skills, love, and courage of those around us to form a shield that adapts to the level of the threat. David eventually reaches the prophet Samuel, having exhausted his options for domestic or political escape. Saul refuses to stop. He sends 3 successive waves of messengers to Samuel's location to seize David by force. Each time, the Spirit of God overwhelms the messengers. Their violent intent is completely neutralized, as they are forced to prophesy alongside the prophets, unable to fulfill their orders. When Saul finally arrives to finish the job himself, the override becomes total. The king is stripped of his royal composure, falling to the ground in a prophetic state for an entire day and night. This is the ultimate reach of divine shielding. When human maliciousness pushes past all ordinary boundaries, God can directly override human agency to disarm the pursuer. The events of this pursuit reveal the stark mechanics of spiritual failure and the relentless nature of God's defense. Saul's trajectory shows that empty promises are structurally unsound. Without genuine repentance, a person remains trapped in a cycle of inevitable collapse. Conversely, divine protection is incredibly versatile, operating through the intervention of people, the orchestration of events, and direct miracles. This reality provides the grounds for an unwavering confidence. Even when opposition feels relentless, there is no cause for despair. The path forward requires a posture of sincere repentance and an absolute trust in a protection that is never limited by the circumstances we face. The survival of a king, the lineage of a future Messiah, and the fate of an entire nation rested on a single, secret arrow. This moment is captured in the historical records of 1 Samuel chapter 20, a text that reads less like an ancient chronicle and more like an intense survival thriller. Israel was in the middle of a succession crisis. David, the man anointed to be the next king, was being hunted by the current one, leaving the kingdom on the edge of a violent internal collapse. To see if David could ever return to the palace, he and his closest ally orchestrated a psychological test during the new moon feast, designed to force the king to reveal his true heart. King Saul was trapped in a cycle of paranoia. He viewed his throne not as a gift to be held for a season, but as a possession to be protected at any cost, even through violence. His son, Jonathan, occupied a very different headspace. As the crown prince, he was the man who had the most to lose if David became king. Yet Jonathan chose to prioritize David's safety over his own royal claim. He was willing to step aside from his inheritance,
effectively surrendering his own future for the sake of a promise. This diagram shows the trap they set, the banquet table at the new moon feast. David's empty chair was the trigger. They knew that if Saul's hatred was permanent, the sight of that vacant seat would cause him to snap. The feast became a collision point between two ways of life, one that clings to power through jealousy and one that finds peace through spiritual surrender. The air in the banquet hall grew heavy as King Saul looked across the table and saw that David had not arrived for the second day. When Jonathan attempted to explain David's absence, Saul's composure shattered. His obsession with control finally spiraled into uncontrollable rage. Saul didn't just shout. He grabbed his spear and hurled it through the air directly at his own son.
The strike missed, but the message was clear. Saul was now so consumed by the need to protect his position that he was willing to murder the very son meant to carry on his legacy. Jonathan stood up and left the table in a cold, fierce anger. He finally had his answer. David's death sentence was now absolute. With the palace now a death trap, the survival of the future king moved from the halls of power to the uncertainty of the open field. The next morning, Jonathan went out to a predetermined spot in the field, carrying his bow and accompanied by a young servant who knew nothing of the secret stakes. This map illustrates the code they used to communicate without words. Jonathan would shoot an arrow, and the distance it traveled past the boy, represented by this dashed line, would tell David whether to stay or run. Jonathan drew his bow and released. The arrow soared through the morning air and landed far out in the field. "The arrow is beyond you," Jonathan called out to the boy. It sounded like a simple instruction to a servant, but it was a life-saving signal to David, who was hiding nearby. In this moment, we see God as a silent protector. He used human ingenuity and a deep, loyal friendship to shield the man he had chosen to lead his people. The code worked perfectly. The warning was received, the escape was triggered, and the future of the nation was preserved. Once the boy was sent back to the city, David emerged from the shadows. The danger was clear, but the pain of the parting was heavier. They stood in a sunlit field, embracing in the shadow of death. They weren't just saying goodbye. They were reaffirming a covenant that would bind their families together for generations. In that embrace, they formally handed over the outcome of their lives to God, acknowledging that their futures were now entirely in His hands. This narrow escape did more than save a life. It ensured that the line leading to the Messiah remained unbroken. Jonathan's willingness to let his own royal future fade so David's could rise provides the ultimate model for a spiritual community, one that prioritizes the calling of others over personal status. David's immediate move into exile also mirrors a deeper spiritual truth. It reminds us that the life of faith often feels like a journey through a world that is not our home, a temporary stay in a land where we are often misunderstood or hunted. When we face our own crises, we often feel the urge to seize control or force the plot to go our way. But this story points to a heavenly director who is orchestrating a much larger narrative. When we stop trying to rewrite our own scripts and instead focus on being faithful in the moments we've been given, we allow God to use our lives in His breathtaking, redemptive epic. Intense fear shatters the ability to think clearly. When the survival instinct takes over, the brain discards long-term strategy in favor of any immediate escape. This is the exact state we find David in during 1 Samuel chapter 21. The warrior who once stood calmly before Goliath is now a fugitive, running in total desperation from the wrath of King Saul. The literal text of this chapter records a sequence of David's failures. He lies to a priest, and he feigns madness, appearing to abandon his integrity to save his life. A reflection from a recent Bible study suggests that these moments of weakness offer a specific insight. They reveal how divine providence continues to move even when a person's faith seems to buckle. Analyzing David's escape shows that God's protection does not wait for us to be brave. It remains active when our own strength is entirely gone. David arrives at the tabernacle in Nob exhausted and empty-handed.
He approaches the priest Ahimelech with a desperate plea for food and a weapon. To explain his presence, David tells the priest he is on a secret mission commanded by the king, and his servants are waiting at a prearranged location. Historically, this has been viewed as a straightforward lie, a desperate man using a false cover story to manipulate a priest. However, David's history of praising God's sovereignty suggests another reading. His reference to the king points to God rather than Saul. While born from panic, his statement functions as an imperfect acknowledgement that his life is still under God's ultimate control. The narrative shows that God does not withdraw his plan because of a believer's survival tactics. Instead, he works through those human limitations to provide the necessary bread and protection. The danger intensifies when David flees to Gath, the home territory of the Philistines. He enters the very gates of the enemy, seeking refuge with King Achish. The recognition is instant. The Philistines identify him as the hero of the Israelite armies, placing David in immediate mortal peril. David reacts by feigning a total loss of sanity. He scratches at the city gates and allows spit to run down his beard, playing the part of a harmless madman to avoid execution. This undignified behavior is often categorized as a moral low point or a total loss of confidence in divine help. Yet the Bible reflection points out that this was a clever, improvised ruse in a life-or-death moment, a strategy that led to his safe release. Despite the humiliating nature of the act, the text indicates that David remained God's chosen leader. His behavior did not negate his calling. This survival tactic became the specific means through which David escaped, demonstrating how God uses even our most desperate and undignified moments to advance a larger purpose. 1 Samuel 21 leaves us with a paradox. The future king of Israel is reduced to a begging fugitive and a feigned madman just to survive the day. This ancient struggle mirrors the modern experience of being pushed to the breaking point, where panic and survival mode take over. In those moments of weakness, the common human response is to feel that our panic-driven choices have permanently disconnected us from God's grace. The insight from the David story encourages a deeper reading of these failures. We see that God's perspective on our lives is not limited to the surface of our worst days. Divine providence operates independently of human perfection. It is a force that covers our frailty and redeems our most desperate actions. Spiritual peace rests on the knowledge that God continues to protect and guide us, specifically when we are at our weakest and most human. The Judean wilderness is a landscape of baked rock and deep ravines. It is a place of absolute isolation, where survival is a daily struggle. Contrast this with the center of national power. King Saul resides in a gilded palace, commanding an elite army and controlling the nation's wealth. From the outside, this looks like the ultimate fortress of security. But the structure is rotting. Saul is consumed by a paranoid jealousy that is destroying his judgment. This is the reality of unchecked sin. It devours a leader's conscience, turning a stable regime into a volatile trap for everyone inside. Meanwhile, David, the man actually anointed to lead, is living as a fugitive. He is hiding in the damp, claustrophobic darkness of a place called the Cave of Adullam. This creates a sharp tension. When a nation is in crisis, human instinct says to seek shelter behind the highest walls and the most established systems. But looking at these two men, we have to ask, is safety found in the palace or in the cave? Worldly power often projects an image of total control, but when that power is disconnected from its divine source, those fortifications become the most dangerous places on earth. This map of tribal regions shows the sacred centers sitting close to the halls of power. Near the capital was the city of Nob, but that proximity proved fatal. Saul, paranoid of conspiracy, orders the unthinkable, the execution of 85 priests. In silent defiance, Saul's own soldiers refuse to draw their swords against the priests. Their conscience acts as a temporary barrier, showing how the Holy Spirit restrains a king's madness through the moral compass of ordinary men. But where the soldiers refuse, an opportunist named Doeg steps forward. He is a man looking to climb the social ladder, and he carries out the slaughter with clinical efficiency. Doeg's actions reveal the nature of a corrupted institution. Once the palace loses its moral core, it will actively seek to destroy any sacred system that it cannot use for its own survival. The massacre at Nob demonstrates a harsh truth. Once a system is compromised by sin, it can no longer offer protection to the faithful. The establishment has become the enemy. While the capital is stained with blood, the scene shifts to the silence and darkness of Adullam. David is hidden deep within the rock. He is soon joined by a group of 400 men. They aren't soldiers. They are the people the world had no use for, those who were crushed by debt, drowning in distress, and bitter with discontent. These misfits represent the reality of humanity under the weight of an oppressive world. They arrive with nothing but their brokenness and their need for a leader who isn't trying to exploit them. Then Abiathar arrives, the sole survivor of the Nob massacre. He reaches the cave exhausted, carrying the weight of his slaughtered family. David takes full responsibility for the tragedy and offers Abiathar a place of absolute safety. He promises that anyone seeking to kill the priest must go through the king first. When Abiathar escaped to the cave, he brought the ephod, the physical means of hearing God. This meant Saul was left with a crown and a palace, but David now held the only man on earth who could speak for the divine. The spiritual center of the nation had moved from the palace to the cave. The organization of the cave offers a different model for a kingdom. While the palace is a rigid pyramid of status and power, the cave functions as a hub where every individual, no matter how fractured, is connected directly to the person of the king. This new structure doesn't rely on the elite. It is built entirely using the materials the world discarded, the bankrupt and the distressed. In this kingdom, weakness isn't a disqualifier, it's the requirement for entry. In this way, David points us towards Jesus Christ. He is the true anointed king standing in the center of the darkness, calling the weary and heavily burdened to find a home with him. The debts and the distress that drove those men into the cave are still with us today. We all face pressures that make us feel like outcasts in our own lives. Our instinct is to fix our own problems, or to find a modern palace, like chasing wealth, building a career, or social standing. We think that if we can just build our walls high enough, we'll be safe. But true safety requires us to abandon our reliance on our own merit. It means dropping our pride and running to hide under the covering of the king, just as those 400 did in Adullam.
David is running for his life. Stripped of his position in the royal court, he is a solitary fugitive crossing the desert, hunted by King Saul and the entire standing army of Israel. The record of this evasion is preserved here in the text of 1 Samuel chapter 23. The narrative details a period of extreme physical vulnerability, where David learns to rely on a process of divine inquiry. Looking at this map of the tribal territories of Israel, we can locate the town of Keilah. While David is hiding from Saul, the Philistine army crosses the border and attacks Keilah, looting the community's threshing floors and seizing their food supply. David is already struggling to keep his own men alive, yet instead of avoiding the conflict, he pauses to ask God if he should go down and defend the city. His 600 followers resist immediately. They are already terrified of Saul, and adding a heavily armed Philistine force to their list of enemies seems like a guaranteed death sentence. Rather than arguing with his militia, David brings the matter back to God a second time. This specific confirmation, a second yes, reassures his followers and provides the resolve they need to march. David's decision to move only after the second inquiry shows a deliberate shift in priority. He chooses to act on the specific direction he received, even when it directly contradicts the survival instincts of his entire camp. After David defeats the Philistines and rescues Keilah, King Saul receives the intelligence. Saul believes David is finally vulnerable, assuming that God has delivered David into his hands by luring him into a walled city. Iron Age cities like Keilah were defined by their fortifications. Saul knows that once his army surrounds these stone foundations and locks down the gates and bars, David will have no physical way to escape the perimeter.
Aware of the approaching siege, David calls for the priest's ephod, a sacred garment used to discern specific answers from God. David asks two direct questions: will Saul come down? And will the citizens of Keilah hand me over? God confirms both fears. The very people David just rescued will hand him over to Saul to ensure their own safety the moment the royal army arrives. David does not demand their loyalty or hold the city hostage in retaliation. He simply gathers his 600 men and quietly slips back out into the wilderness before Saul can reach the gates. He leaves because he recognizes a harsh reality. The gratitude of the people he saved was conditional. Their loyalty ended where their personal risk began. Saul planned his attack based on walls and gates, but David moved based on the insight that those same walls would have eventually become a trap. David retreats into the wilderness of Ziph. In this desolate landscape, the local residents send messengers to King Saul, revealing David's exact coordinates and inviting the army to capture him. In the middle of this isolation, Saul's son Jonathan finds David in the desert. He reminds David of the promise that he will eventually be king of Israel, providing a rare moment of external validation in a landscape defined by betrayal. That promise is tested immediately. Saul's forces arrive and execute a massive pincer movement, splitting their ranks to completely encircle the mountain where David is hiding. This topographical diagram maps the final chase. We see Saul's army in red, divided to cut off all exits, while David's band in blue is pushed toward the center ridge. The red lines close the gap. David has reached a human endpoint, where there is no route through the terrain and no military maneuver left to execute. Right as the capture is imminent, a messenger reaches Saul. The Philistines have launched a massive raid elsewhere, and Saul is forced to abruptly pull his entire army back to defend the nation's borders. Because the siege was broken by a distraction Saul could not ignore, the site was named Selah Hamalekoth, the Rock of Escape, marking the physical boundary that separated the hunted from the hunter. The escape was not engineered by David's scouts or his own tactical brilliance. It was a sovereign distraction, a Philistine raid, that physically pulled Saul away at the exact moment of capture.
Imagine stepping out of the blistering heat of the Judean sun. You cross the threshold into the cool blackness of a deep cavern, completely unaware that heavily armed men are watching your eyes struggle to adjust to the dark. This manhunt plays out in the unforgiving En-Gedi wilderness. A fugitive army vanishes easily into the porous limestone cliffs dominating this arid landscape. The historical text specifically places this encounter at the Crags of the Wild Goats. It's a treacherous, precarious ecosystem where a single misstep is lethal. Deep inside one of these caverns, David holds an absolute tactical advantage. King Saul, the man hunting him down, is entirely at his mercy. David's men whisper in the dark, urging him to strike. They frame this assassination as a divine gift, insisting God has finally delivered the enemy into his hands. David is standing at a crossroads where logic and peer pressure point toward a blade, forcing a choice between the easy path of a convenient outcome and the difficult demands of a higher command. We find this decision's mechanics recorded in 1 Samuel 24. This parchment carries the weight of history. The men's argument reveals a dangerous trap, using religious language to justify political murder. Claiming God orchestrated this creates an illusion of providence based entirely on convenience. David refuses the logic of convenience. He looks at his vulnerable enemy and chooses to see the Lord's anointed. His reverence for the divine order outweighs his very human desire to seize the throne immediately. Instead of driving a blade through the king, David creeps forward and quietly cuts away a corner of Saul's robe. It is an act of restraint that secretly proves he commanded the situation entirely. Saul spends his days projecting power in the sunlight, parading an army across the desert. David quietly secures his moral authority in absolute darkness, unseen by anyone but the men beside him. Spiritual obedience demands the discipline to reject the most efficient human solution when it requires compromising your integrity. The tension breaks when Saul leaves the cave.
David follows him out into the light and shouts across the canyon. He holds up the severed fabric, offering undeniable physical proof that he spared the king's life. Saul's reaction is explosive. He weeps loudly in front of both armies. He publicly declares David's righteousness, calling him a son. On the surface, it looks like a beautiful, spontaneous moment of reconciliation. But we have to ask, is this king actually experiencing a change of heart? Or is this the emotional whiplash of a man who just realized he was seconds away from a fatal blow? To understand his reaction, we must look at his behavioral pattern earlier in the text.
Back in Samuel 15, Saul was confronted with a severe moral failure. His response then exposes exactly how his mind works now. Saul has a history of prioritizing his public image over his internal state. Years earlier, after a blatant act of disobedience, he didn't ask for a clean heart. He begged the prophet Samuel to stand beside him so the elders would still see him as a king. Even in his prayers, he revealed a distance that couldn't be ignored, referring to God as Samuel's God rather than his own. That brings us back to the canyon outside the cave. Saul is weeping, but he completely ignores God. He directs his pleas for mercy and blessing squarely at David. He asks a human rival to protect his royal legacy. This flowchart visualizes the core theological failure. True repentance requires vertical submission, an arrow pointing directly upward to God. Saul only operates horizontally. His remorse deflects outward, toward the elders to save face, or toward David to save his family line. Tears shed out of fear for your legacy, or relief from surviving a brush with death, carries zero weight if your heart remains stubbornly alienated from God. Look at the pieces on the board in this moment, and a radical alternate history emerges. What if Saul had recognized David's anointing right there in the dust, submitted to God vertically, and stepped down? Picture the crown passing peacefully between them. A king surrenders his authority not because he was defeated in battle, but because he finally submitted to the divine order. The historical shift would have been absolute. By stepping down, Saul would have prevented the looming years of civil war, keeping the tribes unified and sparing the blood of thousands of Israelite soldiers. For Saul himself, it offered an exit from the spiral of paranoia and the brutal end awaiting him on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. He could have finished his life in peace, rather than in the shadow of a losing battle. Instead, the historical reality snaps back into focus. The tears dry. Saul turns his back on the canyon, returns to his standing army, and grips a crown he has already lost. Unchecked pride isolates a leader, turning moments of potential grace into guaranteed generational tragedies. Two kings stood in the wilderness of En-Gedi. David's quiet restraint forged a legacy of enduring faith, while Saul's loud public tears masked a hollow, unrepentant heart. This narrative asks us to evaluate our own default reactions under pressure. Are our choices driven by the optics of human approval or the quiet discipline of obedience? It is highly tempting to look at a smooth, convenient path and assume it is a sign of blessing. The voices around you will often tell you to take what you can get. The ultimate measure of a leader's heart isn't found in the apologies they perform when they are caught. It is found in what they refuse to do when they hold the power to take the easy way out. In a recent Bible study reflection on the 25th chapter of 1 Samuel, we find a story defined by profound tension. It is a historical account of a conflict that teetered on the very edge of disaster. David is now without the man who first anointed him. Samuel's death removes the primary spiritual mentor and elder who once provided a moral compass for his actions. Without Samuel, David's situation is entirely unmoored. He is currently a fugitive living in the harsh wilderness, bearing the immense weight of commanding a desperate, rough-around-the-edges militia of 600 men. Living near this wilderness is a man named Nabal. Nabal possesses immense wealth, but his character is completely bankrupt. He is exceedingly foolish and notoriously harsh and aggressively ungrateful. Then there is Nabal's wife, Abigail. She acts as a stark, direct contrast to her husband.
Abigail is deeply intelligent, marked by diplomatic wisdom, and highly regarded for her beauty. You have David, volatile and grieving in the desert. You have Nabal, wealthy and arrogant. And you have Abigail, the solitary voice of reason. Together, they form a psychological powder keg waiting for a single spark to set it off. Prior to this moment, David's militia and Nabal's camp actually had a functioning relationship. David's men faithfully protected Nabal's shepherds and flocks out in the wilderness without stealing a single animal from his vast inventory. In the culture of the era, there was a strict expectation for this kind of unofficial security. When a wealthy landowner profited from that protection, it was customary to provide a reward of basic supplies when politely requested. David sends 10 men to make that polite request. Nabal blatantly violates the cultural custom. He rejects the request entirely, aggressively turning them away and hurling a series of venomous insults directly at David's men. When the message reaches David, he completely loses his temper. The rejection pushes him over the edge, and he immediately mobilizes his troops with a single, brutal objective: slaughter every innocent male in Nabal's household. David is now moving toward a massacre based entirely on a bruised ego. He has shifted from a leader seeking provisions to a commander seeking the systematic elimination of an entire household, including those who did him no harm. Word of David's impending, heavily armed march reaches Nabal's estate. While Nabal remains entirely oblivious to the chaos he just caused, Abigail's situational awareness kicks in. She grasps the existential threat to her household instantly. Looking at this map tracking the advancing force, we see the logistics of her problem. Abigail doesn't panic. She pivots. She independently initiates a massive crisis management protocol while David's men march. The volume of the peace offering she gathers is staggering. She loads a caravan with fresh bread, wine, sheep, and grain. True wisdom in the face of destruction requires rapid action to intercept the disaster before it breaches your gates. Abigail intercepts David physically on the road. The moment she sees him, she drops to the ground and bows at his feet. It is an immediate display of extreme humility, acting as a complete rejection of her husband's towering arrogance. She then executes a highly calculated diplomatic strategy. First, she deliberately absorbs the full blame for her husband's foolishness. By taking the fault onto herself, she effectively diffuses David's primary target of aggression. Next, she forces a perspective shift. She redirects David's focus entirely away from this petty, momentary vengeance and reminds him of his grand, divine destiny as the future king of Israel. Finally, she delivers a strictly logical warning. If he slaughters innocent people today, that blood will permanently stain his conscience and legitimize the criticisms of his political enemies tomorrow. Here, we see David's crucial character strength. Despite his burning anger and the fact that he has hundreds of armed men backing him, he refuses to be stubborn. He chooses to listen to reason, and he finally halts his murderous advance. Successful de-escalation requires two equal halves. It needs a peacemaker brave enough to speak the hard truth, and it requires a powerful leader who is humble enough to swallow their pride and actually listen. The conflict diffuses, and David returns to the wilderness. It isn't until the next morning that Nabal finally learns exactly how close his arrogance brought his entire household to total annihilation. The sheer terror of this realization triggers a severe physiological reaction. Nabal's body turns rigid like stone, paralyzing him entirely. 10 days later, he dies by God's hand. With Nabal dead, the immediate historical resolution falls into place. David sends for Abigail and marries her, officially recognizing and valuing the unparalleled wisdom she displayed on the road. Historically speaking, David's multiple marriages, taking Abigail and Ahinoam as wives after his first wife Michal was given to another man, planted deep seeds for future family strife. Yet, in the broader biblical narrative, God still viewed David's overall path as righteous. Because David completely relinquished his right to personal vengeance, he didn't have to carry the moral weight of a massacre. He allowed divine justice to execute a much cleaner, more definitive resolution. When anger dictates a decision, the result rarely accounts for logic. David's initial plan would have secured the supplies he needed, but his rage nearly cost him the very moral standing he would eventually need as king. There are spiritual mechanics at play in restraint. Refusing to give in to impulsive, retaliatory urges actively denies the devil a foothold in your life, and it leaves the battlefield wide open for God's intervention. The confrontation between Abigail and David proves that stepping back from our own wrath and choosing to trust God is the only way to ensure true justice is served without staining our own souls. Imagine enduring years of unfair treatment, and suddenly a path to a quick resolution opens wide. In these high-stakes moments, a perfect opportunity often doubles as a spiritual trap. This is the reality David faces. He is backed into a corner in this unforgiving wilderness, unjustly hunted and vastly outnumbered by King Saul's elite strike force of 3,000 soldiers. Instead of retreating further, David takes the initiative. Under the cover of darkness, he and his right-hand man, Abishai, quietly slip past the outer perimeter and infiltrate the very center of the enemy camp. They find the entire army in the grip of an unnatural, divinely induced sleep. No guards are on watch. King Saul lies on the ground before them, completely exposed and entirely vulnerable. To any observer, the divine setup is undeniable. It appears as though God has handed David the perfect chance for a clean, surgical strike to secure his own vindication. Standing over the sleeping king, Abishai leans in and whispers the obvious conclusion: God has delivered your enemy into your hands today. He practically begs David for the order to strike. Abishai's advice carries immense weight because it sounds so spiritual. It aligns perfectly with their military capability and promises an immediate end to David's suffering, wrapping a tempting shortcut in the language of divine providence. But David refuses the shortcut, asking a question that halts the momentum. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David disregards the ease of the situation and the depth of Saul's crimes. He focuses entirely on the fact that Saul carries God's anointing. For David, respecting the position God established is a direct act of honoring God himself. True maturity requires evaluating an opportunity against God's explicitly revealed will, rather than its immediate benefits. Even the most inviting shortcuts can lead directly into a moral trap. David chooses a different path. He reaches down and quietly removes Saul's spear and a water jug from right beside the king's head, physical artifacts that will serve as undeniable proof of his mercy. He slips back into the night, climbing to a safe, elevated distance on the opposite hill. Only when a massive canyon separates them does he break the silence, shouting across the valley to wake the sleeping camp. His tone is remarkably humble. David avoids the language of a conquering hero, instead asking why the king of Israel is spending so much effort hunting a dead dog, a flea. Yet that humility coexists with a firm reproach. He calls out Saul's commanding general, Abner, for failing in his primary duty to protect the king. David demonstrates that standing for truth and righteousness never requires adopting the toxic, aggressive behavior of one's oppressor. Down in the camp, King Saul wakes up and realizes his life was spared. Overwhelmed by the grace he didn't deserve, he publicly admits his failure. I have played the fool and erred exceedingly. Despite this emotional apology, David makes a critical choice. He refuses to walk down the hill and return to Saul's side. He understands the distinction between extending forgiveness and restoring trust. David lets go of bitterness without foolishly returning to a dangerous and unstable relationship. This encounter in the wilderness establishes a clear principle. Enduring severe injustice does not grant someone the right to forcefully overthrow the authority God has placed over them. David's legacy as a man after God's own heart rests on these high-pressure moments. When given the chance to seize his own interests, he chose the fear of God over his own convenience. It is one of the most jarring decisions in biblical history. Israel's greatest future king voluntarily surrendering to his sworn enemies. This moment from 1 Samuel chapter 27 serves as the foundation for a practical devotional study. It exposes exactly what happens when our faith runs out. To understand the decision, we have to look at the harsh reality of David's life up to this point. He has spent years on the run, hunted relentlessly across brutal, unforgiving wilderness by King Saul. The exhaustion is absolute. Verse 1 reveals his psychological breaking point. David looks at his circumstances and tells himself, "I will be destroyed one day by the hand of Saul." He calculates his odds using pure human logic and concludes his situation is hopeless. In his panic, he makes a life-altering choice to flee to Philistia. And noticeably absent from this entire process is any mention of him consulting God. What happens when a believer abandons God's promises for the sake of a logical shortcut? David's next 16 months would reveal exactly what it costs to maintain that artificial safety. David arrives in enemy territory with 600 men and immediately strikes a political alliance with Achish, the Philistine king of Gath. At first glance, the shortcut seems to work perfectly. Achish rewards David's defection by granting him the remote city of Ziklag. David finally has a home, safety from Saul, and a chance to rest. But living under enemy protection requires rent. To justify his presence and maintain his safety, David has to prove his ongoing military value to the Philistine crown. David launches brutal raids south against non-Israelite tribes, but he tells Achish he attacked his own people in Judah. The deception secures the total trust of King Achish, who now believes David is permanently hated by the Israelites. This is the hidden nature of the rational shortcut. The safety David built requires constant maintenance, forcing him to tell larger and larger lies to keep the entire arrangement from collapsing. To protect his lie, David commits a severe atrocity. He slaughters everyone in the targeted towns, men and women, so that no survivors can ever make it to Gath and expose his true raiding paths to the king. The man described as being after God's own heart is now acting as a ruthless warlord. A single decision born out of fear has mutated into unimaginable violence. Eventually, the trap snaps shut. David's deception was so convincing that when Achish rallies the Philistine army for a massive new campaign, he commands David to march beside him. The target of this new campaign is King Saul. David is now marching to war against his own Israelite brethren. His attempt at self-rescue has cornered him into a nightmare scenario. If he fights for the Philistines, he destroys his own people. If he turns against Achish in the battle, he and his men will be wiped out. Human logic has left him with zero viable options. 1 Samuel 29 opens with David marching toward the battlefield, trapped deep within the enemy ranks. There is no human way out of this dilemma. This is exactly where God's sovereign intervention overrides David's mistakes. God doesn't use a lightning bolt or a parting sea. Instead, he uses the sharp political paranoia of the other Philistine commanders. Seeing David in the ranks, the commanders are furious. They refuse to march into battle with a Hebrew who could easily turn on them to win back Saul's favor. They force Achish to send David away immediately. Through this simple political dispute, God actively prevents David from slaughtering his own people. He remains faithful to his chosen king, honoring his promises even when David had completely forgotten them. God's protection is entirely capable of outmaneuvering our flawed human logic, quietly rescuing us from the disastrous corners we back ourselves into. But David's detour still has consequences. He and his men march back to Ziklag, only to find the city burned to the ground and their families taken captive by the Amalekites. Standing in the ashes, listening to his own grieving men talk about stoning him, David hits rock bottom. Every piece of security he tried to manufacture through logic and deception is completely shattered. And right here, finally, the running stops. In the middle of the ruin, the scriptures say David found strength in the Lord his God. He repents and turns back to the only true source of stability. The smoking ruins of Ziklag highlight the danger of fear-driven logic. When we begin calculating our survival based only on what we can see, we often end up building the very traps we were trying to escape. Real safety is not found in the perfect human shortcut, but in the bedrock of God's promises, an anchor that holds firm regardless of how desperate the surrounding landscape appears. Sometimes God permits the fragile, self-made plans we build to burn down, but He does it so that, standing in the ashes, we are driven back to the true source of our strength. A heavily disguised leader trudges through the dark, treacherous landscape of ancient Israel, risking everything on a desperate midnight journey. This is King Saul. With a massive Philistine army gathering to destroy him, he is making a dangerous 16-kilometer trek to the town of Endor, deliberately defying his own strict laws to seek out a medium. The ancient Hebrew text of 1 Samuel, specifically chapter 28, provides the theological autopsy of this moment, detailing how a chosen king falls to such depths. Saul's crisis is absolute. He has frantically sought God's guidance through every accepted channel. He looked for answers in dreams, consulted the sacred Urim stones of the priesthood, and petitioned the prophets. He received absolute silence. God's silence functions as an active, severe form of judgment, pushing an unrepentant man toward his breaking point. This chart tracks King Saul's reign, illustrating the long trajectory of spiritual decay that eventually led him to the cave at Endor. The descent begins in chapter 13. Driven by impatience before a battle, Saul steps out of bounds to offer an unauthorized sacrifice, triggering his first divine warning that his kingdom will not endure. He drops further in chapter 15. Ordered to entirely destroy the Amalekites, Saul spares their king and hoards the best of their livestock, attempting to mask pure greed as religious devotion. By chapters 18 through 26, the moral floor collapses. Consumed by paranoia, Saul relentlessly hunts his loyal commander David and slaughters an entire city of innocent priests to protect his fading power. Ignoring repeated minor warnings progressively blinds a leader, lowering their moral threshold until seeking out dark magic becomes the only logical next step. Saul sits on a royal throne, surrounded by the physical luxury of the crown, yet he remains trapped in spiritual darkness and isolation. Compare that to David. David is a hunted outlaw hiding in a barren wilderness, yet he actively receives clear, immediate directions from God through the priestly ephod. A divine connection relies entirely on an internal posture of genuine humility and repentance. A flawless track record or high political office offers zero advantage. At Endor, the seance actually works, but only because God sovereignly intervenes to send the spirit of Samuel. The medium recoils in terror as God bypasses her illusions, forcing the actual prophet to appear with a final, devastating message. Samuel delivers the verdict. God has officially become Saul's enemy, and by this time tomorrow, Saul and his sons will die on the battlefield. The psychological weight of this prophecy crushes Saul. He collapses face first into the dirt, totally paralyzed by fear. Yet, even in his final hours, he refuses to say the words, "I have sinned." David's history of confession proves that being terrified of impending consequences differs from possessing a broken, repentant heart. This forces a direct reflection. When we face closed doors or a season of divine silence, do we frantically search for dark workarounds, or do we pause to examine our own hearts? Saul's failure and subsequent death end his dynasty, but God's overarching plan for Israel continues as authority transfers to David's lineage. The tragedy of 1 Samuel 28 stands as an enduring historical warning. Absolute spiritual ruin is the final, inevitable harvest of small, unrepentant compromises. Look closely at this ancient Hebrew parchment. This scroll contains the text of 1 Samuel chapter 29, outlining one of the most agonizing political traps in recorded history. The story centers right here, among the ruins of the Aphek fortress. Thousands of Philistine soldiers are massing in this exact location, preparing for a decisive invasion into Israelite territory. If you inspect the ranks of this invading army, you find a jarring anomaly. Marching right alongside the Philistines is David, the anointed future king of Israel. He didn't join them out of treason. David has been living as a fugitive, hiding deep behind enemy lines to survive relentless assassination attempts by his own ruler, King Saul. For months, blending in kept him alive. Now that survival strategy has backfired, locking him onto a direct collision course with his homeland. In this logic tree, if David sides with the Philistines, he slaughters his own people, permanently destroying his right to the Israelite throne. Alternatively, turning his weapons against the Philistines mid-battle commits treason against King Achish, his only asylum provider. It is a zero-sum game. If he fights for physical survival, he destroys his identity and faith. If he stays loyal to Israel, he guarantees his immediate execution. He lacks the political leverage or military power to extract himself. Every conceivable move on the board leads to his ruin. The tension breaks when the Philistine coalition lords begin inspecting their troops. As they review the rearguard, they spot David and his band of Hebrew mercenaries. These commanders are immediately suspicious, and history is on their side. In past conflicts, Hebrew mercenaries have a known track record of flipping their allegiances mid-combat to rejoin their countrymen. The Philistine lords see a massive tactical vulnerability in their rearguard. They calculate the easiest way for David to win back King Saul's favor would be by turning his blade against the Philistines. Look at this ancient iron dagger. This artifact highlights the reality of the era's battlefield stakes. The Philistines maintained military superiority through their monopoly on iron weapons like this one, refusing to give a rogue Hebrew unit the chance to use that weaponry against them. The commanders issue an absolute veto against David's participation, creating an immovable political blockade that forces the issue all the way up to their king. The response from the Philistine leadership is fractured. King Achish steps in and fiercely defends David, arguing with his own generals to keep the Hebrew mercenaries in the ranks. Achish's trust isn't baseless. During his time in exile, David executed his duties with such careful precision that he convinced the king of his absolute loyalty. But the Philistine political system relies on a coalition. Even with royal authority, King Achish doesn't hold absolute power. The unified front of the Philistine lords possesses enough collective leverage to overrule their monarch. Trapped by his own generals, Achish executes a tactical dismissal. To prevent a mutiny, he diplomatically orders David to pack up his men and leave the encampment before dawn. David plays his part perfectly. He feigns deep insult, questioning why the king would doubt his loyalty, all while silently preparing his troops for an immediate retreat. It is a brilliant paradox. David's flawless conduct in exile built a shield of trust with the king, yet the bitter suspicion of his fiercest enemies triggered his extraction from the trap. As the sun rises, David and his men march away toward the city of Ziklag, leaving the battlefield behind them. He faced a scenario that guaranteed his destruction, and it was neutralized without a single weapon being drawn. This is a textbook example of providential preservation, the concept of God's invisible hand guiding the visible mechanics of earthly politics. The Philistine lords made their demands based entirely on their own selfish military strategy, yet they functioned as the exact instrument God used to rescue the future king of Israel. This humiliating public rejection functioned as a precise divine extraction from a war David could never win. This narrow bottleneck at Aphek served as a necessary crucible for David, shaping his reliance on a higher power before he could eventually assume the throne. God allowed him to walk to the edge of disaster. When human cunning ran out, David had no choice but to rely on divine sovereignty to survive. When viewed through the lens of a modern Bible study, David's trap mirrors the spiritual dilemmas people face today, where individuals feel paralyzed by conflicting loyalties. God sovereignly manages these catch-22s, often utilizing the bitter opposition of adversaries to protect our integrity. True providential preservation requires trusting the unseen strategist when the visible circumstances around us offer absolutely no way out. David and his men had just returned from a disastrous military detour, a campaign where David had been caught lying to the Philistines and nearly forced to fight against his own people. But any relief from that narrow escape shattered the moment they crested the final hill and saw their home, still smoking in the desert sun. Ziklag had been burned to the ground. While the soldiers were away playing a double game with the Philistine kings, Amalekite raiders had swept through the undefended city, carrying off every wife, every child, and every physical possession. 600 battle-hardened mercenaries, men who survived by their physical toughness, completely collapsed. The biblical text records that they wept until they literally had no physical strength left to cry. The smoke at Ziklag was the physical result of a spiritual drift. David's reliance on his own deception had left his family and his relationship with God in ruins, creating the ultimate stress test for any leader. Grief quickly curdled into targeted rage. The men looked at the ashes of their families, looked at the leader whose compromises had left them vulnerable, and started picking up heavy stones to execute David on the spot. This is the default human operating system in a crisis. When we face sudden trauma, our adrenaline spikes. We panic, we demand a scapegoat to carry the blame, and we look for immediate revenge to balance the psychological ledger. But executing the commander wouldn't bring back a single stolen child. Panicked, reactionary violence is incapable of solving a deficit this massive. Surviving this would require an entirely different operational framework. Instead of drawing his sword to fight back, or turning to flee into the desert, David did the exact opposite of what survival instinct dictates. He stopped completely and grounded himself. David turned inward to address the distance he had created between himself and God. He faced the reality of his recent lies and his detour into enemy territory, engaging in a deliberate process of repentance to repair the relationship his own choices had fractured. Only after that internal correction did he look outward. Before mounting a rescue mission, David called the priest to bring the ephod, the sacred garment used to seek divine direction. The response he received was a precise 3-part operational mandate: pursue the enemy, you will overtake them, and you will recover absolutely everything. True recovery begins exactly here. A leader must actively hit the brakes on their immediate emotional impulses and subjugate their natural reactions to a deliberate inquiry of divine will. Once David had absolute clarity, the pause ended. He instantly pivoted from stillness into explosive action, leading his men on a grueling, high-speed march straight into the harsh desert terrain. This visual maps out the logistical reality of that forced march. Out of a total force of 600, 200 of those men hit a physical wall of exhaustion and had to drop out completely when they reached the Besser Brook. David didn't hesitate. He left the exhausted men to guard the supplies and pressed forward with only 400 soldiers, prioritizing the mandate he received from God over the grim military probability of attacking a larger raiding party with a reduced force. They eventually tracked down the sprawling Amalekite camp, which was scattered and celebrating their massive haul. David's strike was aggressive, relentless, and completely overwhelming. The aftermath matched the promise exactly. They rescued every single captive wife and child without a single casualty, and reclaimed massive herds of livestock the Amalekites had stolen from across the region. The reclamation of every stolen life and item followed David's immediate choice to move on the instructions he was given, even when his physical resources were severely depleted. The victory immediately triggered a new conflict. As the army reunited at the brook, a faction of what the text calls wicked men demanded that the 200 exhausted soldiers who stayed behind receive none of the captured wealth, only their rescued families. Their human logic advocated for a strict, merit-based economy where rewards flow only to the subgroup that fought. David rejected this. Because God handed over the enemy, the victory belonged to him. Therefore, spoils must be distributed equally to everyone. If we view our successful recoveries as a direct product of our own grit and merit, we completely misunderstand the mechanics of divine grace. God's provision isn't a paycheck for our performance. David even extended this principle outward, taking the surplus livestock and sending it as gifts to the elders of Judah. By distributing wealth he didn't strictly earn, he was strategically paving the way for his future kingship through radical generosity. At some point, you will face your own version of Ziklag. Sudden, catastrophic crises, often worsened by our own mistakes, are a universal certainty. When the bottom drops out, the protocol is strict. Refuse the instinct to panic or blame. Stop and repent. Actively seek divine direction, and then execute with absolute obedience. Because when the smoke finally clears and everything is recovered, our ultimate restoration is never a trophy of our human resilience. It is a lasting testament to God's unmerited grace.
Urgent, bronze swords clash against shields, the air chokes with dust, and the Israelite army breaks rank in total panic. The slaughter by the Philistines is the physical manifestation of a spiritual fracture. Decades of autonomy and rebellion against divine authority have reached their inevitable conclusion on the battlefield. This photograph shows the strategic trap. The wide Jezreel Valley funnels directly into the steep, rocky slopes of Mount, leaving Providence. In a single afternoon, the royal lineage is severed, and the future of the dynasty is erased. Saul himself is struck by archers. Severely wounded, and realizing capture means public torture and mockery, he is gripped by the terror of his enemy's cruelty. To avoid falling alive into the hands of the Philistines, the king of Israel draws his own sword and falls on it. For years, Saul had operated in silence, cut off from any word or guidance from God. When a leader is left entirely to their own devices, when the spirit has departed, the result is a total, suffocating darkness. Saul's suicide serves as a stark baseline for human glory. Without divine support, the highest earthly power eventually returns to the dust of the mountain. The next morning, Philistine scavengers find the royal remains. They strip Saul of his armor and carry it as a trophy to the temple of their idols. This move shifts the narrative from a military loss to a spiritual claim. By displaying the armor in their temple, the Philistines are declaring that their gods have triumphed over the God of Israel. The humiliation culminates at the city of Bethshan. There, the Philistines take the headless body of the king and nail it to the exterior city walls for the world to see. These stone walls illustrate the sheer inaccessibility of these ancient strongholds. From the top of these fortifications, Saul's body was displayed as absolute defeat. This gruesome display is the logical end of a regime built on self-reliance. A total collapse into spiritual and physical shame. Even in this ruin, a different kind of power emerges. Jonathan, a man of character and faith, chose to stand and guide beside a father who spent years trying to destroy his future. Jonathan's choice introduces the concept of covenant loyalty. It is a grace that stays even when the recipient is entirely unworthy of the sacrifice. This loyalty is mirrored miles away by the warriors of Jabesh-Gilead. Upon hearing of the king's humiliation, they immediately organize a rescue mission. This map illustrates the scale of their commitment. To reach Beth-shan, these men crossed the Jordan Valley and infiltrated enemy territory at night. Their motivation was a debt of grace. Years earlier, Saul saved Jabesh-Gilead. Now they risk everything to restore his dignity. This response, of a redeemed people risking themselves to cover the shame of a fallen leader, provides a blueprint for the spiritual community. It is a portrait of the church moving toward the broken to offer protection and restoration. Even at the height of divine judgment, God permits these sparks of loyalty to prove that grace survives the collapse of human strength. The historical tragedy at Gilboa serves as a shadow of a greater reality. To see the full picture, we have to look from the failure of one mountain to the victory of another. Saul fell on his sword to escape judgment and preserve his own pride. On Calvary, Jesus Christ stood in the center of judgment, specifically to exhaust it.
The true king allowed himself to be stripped, pierced, and nailed to wood. He accepted the public shame that Saul could not endure, but he did it to pay a debt that wasn't his. Christ fulfilled the loyalty shown by Jonathan and the men of Jabesh-Gilead. He intentionally stepped onto a cursed battlefield to stand with those who were already lost. Directly to viewer, this narrative reveals a difficult truth. In the story of Gilboa, we are not the heroes. We are represented by Saul, broken, self-willed, and entirely unworthy of the rescue we need. But Christ's sacrifice reverses the tragedy. Instead of being conquered by the curse, he embraced it to conquer death, ensuring that the shame of the past does not dictate the future. Every kingdom built on the foundation of self-reliance eventually meets its own Gilboa, a point where the weight of its own pride causes it to collapse. final, resonant tone. Security is found only by abandoning our own bankrupt attempts at power and surrendering to the sovereign king who laid down his life to win the victory for us.